Hey guys, so about a year ago, I made a winner ranking of Survivor US, ranking every winner based off the games that they played, and I really enjoyed that video, so much so that I figured, you know what, let's do a ranking of the runners up now. So in this video, I'll be ranking every runner up in the history of Survivor US, ranking every single person who made it to Final Tribal but lost a jury vote at the end. And this ended up being an even bigger list in the winner ranking for obvious reasons. Whereas of the recording this video being right after Survivor 47, we have had 15 seasons with a final 2 and 32 seasons with a final 3, giving us a grand total of 79 runners up to rank here. And obviously, it was very difficult to rank all of them. There were a lot of people that were just pretty close to each other, and it was difficult to figure out where exactly to place them, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 79 runners up to rank here, and let's waste any more time. Let's go right into the video. So starting off at number 79, and if you watched my winner ranking, I feel like these bottom two should be pretty obvious, as these are the two runners up who have been voted out and had to come back into the game. And I feel like within that, there's a pretty clear order as well. But number 79, the worst runner up in Survivor history, is Natalie Anderson from Winners at War. And obviously, there's a lot to criticize with Natalie's game. She was the first boot of the season, and while she got pretty unlucky in that first round with her being on the same tribe as Jeremy, that made them this pretty obvious duo, she was still taking out the first opportunity, never surviving a single round of gameplay. And from that point on, she spends the majority of the game on Edge of Extinction, where, as I talked about with Chris Underwood on my winner ranking, is not really playing the game of Survivor. I feel like being on the edge gives you a massive advantage with you not having to vote people out while still getting to bond with the people of the jury. And while I think this particular cast was not likely to vote for the edge person and base it more on the actual game, I feel like it's still an advantage that Natalie had over other people that we'll be talking about on this list. But she comes back to the game at the final 6, and from that point on, doesn't play particularly well, where while she does align with Michelle, who is a clear outsider at that point, she almost never gets her way, and also never survives a round of gameplay without some sort of immunity. Where at the final 6, she has an idol that she had gotten through the edge, is able to play on herself, but even then, is unable to get out her main target in Sarah due to the majority being able to put all their votes onto Denise, who was the clear 4th in the alliance. At the final 5, she was going to be the target again until she finds an idol that causes the target to shift to Michelle, but even then, she still plays the idol on herself, not even trying to make a big move, and even then, kind of lucks her way into voting out Ben to do Ben telling Sarah to vote him out, which is pretty silly there. Now, Final 4, she just wins immunity and doesn't even put herself into fire against Tony, who was clearly the biggest threat at that point. So I feel like Natalie plays about as terribly as she could have, considering that she was the edge returnee and considering that she was playing on a season that was valuing strong gameplay over the game that Natalie played, where she literally never survives a single round of gameplay without some sort of immunity, and even then doesn't really make any moves to further her game and to give the jury a reason to vote for her. And while she does get 4 jury votes at the end against Tony, and probably would have gotten more if Tony were taken out, I feel like none of them had to do with the game that she was playing, where obviously she was going to get the votes of Jeremy, for instance. But beyond that, I feel like Natalie played pretty poorly, and mixing that in with the fact that she was voted out and had to come back into the game, I feel like Natalie was clearly the worst runner-up for me, which is why she's here at number 79. Now moving on to number 78, and we have the other runner-up who was voted out and had to come back into the game, and that is Lillian Morris from Survivor Pearl Islands. And for me, there was a pretty clear gap between Lil and Natalie, considering that Lil was in the game for much longer than Natalie, and also had a lot more influence in how the game played out compared to Natalie. But similar to Natalie, Lil does have a pretty rocky start to the season, where she is clearly at the bottom of the Morgan tribe, and while she does get through the Nicole round all right, she immediately loses her closest ally, Skinny Ryan, at the second tribal, and then she's the next boot afterwards, being the third boot of the season. And obviously that's pretty bad, and in every other season of the show before this, she would have been done. But she's able to come back into the game at the merge through the Outcast twist, and from that point on, she actually becomes a pretty key swing vote during a lot of rounds there, where initially she flips on her old tribe to take out Savage and Rhino, but then the final 8, she flips with Fairplay and Burton to take out Rupert. And while she was clearly the third in the Fairplay Burton trio, she eventually flips on them, taking out Burton at the final 5. She gets to the final 3, where both Fairplay and Sandra are going to take her to the end, only for her to win immunity herself, where she technically makes the wrong decision here in taking Sandra to the end over Fairplay. As while she would have had a better shot of winning against Fairplay, she also didn't want to risk Fairplay wasting the money on partying and drugs, so take that for what you will. But on paper, it is a decent post merge for Lil, where she is voting the majority for pretty much the entire time and is technically a swing vote for a lot of those rounds. Though I think there are a few issues that kind of bring it back down for me, where for one, I feel like a lot of the moves she was making was out of emotion, where she ends up working with Fairplay and Burton because they made her feel welcome, but then later flits against him because they didn't make her feel welcome. And I feel like so much of Lil's game is driven by emotion and her feeling like this clear outsider, as opposed to her actively making strategic moves to better her position. I also think she couldn't really win the game by the end of it, where even though she makes the wrong decision in voting out Fairplay at Final 3, it didn't really matter if she would have lost against anyone. Or some of that was due to her being voted out of the game and there being this anti-outcast sentiment where her best case scenario was being against Burton, the other outcast, but even then she would have lost to him. But I think a lot of it was also a lot of people just not liking her that much and thinking that she was annoying. Or even the pre-merge boots, the people that voted her back into the game did so because they hated her and they didn't want her to ruin their pre-jury vacation. So even that, it stems from her not being very well liked out there. And on top of that, she was voted out of the game and had come back to begin with. All these things drag her down towards the bottom of the list. But considering she had more of an impact on the game compared to Natalie Anderson, I feel like it was just enough to have her above her, which is why she's here at number 78. Now moving on to number 77, and from this point on, every single runner-up lasted the entire game, lasting all 39 days of their season, or 26 in the case of the new era players, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But at number 77, we have a pretty notorious bad runner-up here, someone who played the game all wrong and somehow still made it to the end. But number 77, we do have Nora from Survivor Island of the Idols. And Nora is an interesting case here, as she is definitely someone that wanted to play the game and was definitely trying to make moves at certain opportunities, but was A, towards the bottom of the power structure for the entire season, and B, also made plenty of bad decisions along the way that ruined their chances of doing well, where right at the bat, she is towards the bottom of the Vokai power structure, and while she does vote in the majority during the Molly round, she doesn't really have anyone by her side aside from Jason, I guess, or she doesn't really have any agency until the Jack blindside that happens right before the merge, where while she isn't the orchestrator of that plan, she's actually one of the few people that's actually pulled into that plan by Kelly, and they're able to pull off that move. But then Nora immediately blows up their spot afterwards by exposing the fact that Kelly was the orchestrator of this move, and that paints a target on Kelly's back moving forward, and she's later blindsided the following round where she's on the outs when Kelly goes home. That's not particularly great, and while she votes in the majority for most rounds moving forward, she's not really in the majority alliance at that point, where despite her being this clear GOAT, she's not really being pulled into any plans and just kind of scraping on by. We get to the final 8 where she's once again given an opportunity to make a move by potentially pulling off this Tommy blindside, but she ends up sketching out Dean to the point where Dean leaks that plan to Tommy in the middle of Tribal, and Nora just blows up the plan entirely by revealing that Elaine has an idol. And there was a chance that Nora could have gone home with that Tribal had Elaine played her idol on Karishma, but she's able to get through that. She also gets really benefited by Dan Spilo being ejected at the final 6, where while it was the correct decision at the point to pull Dan from the game, Nora was also in a spot to where had the game played out naturally that she probably would have been cut at final 4, where Tommy, Dean, and Dan had a solid final 3, and had they been able to run the table, Nora wouldn't even gotten to final 3, and she wouldn't even be on this list. So she gets pretty lucky there, and then she ends up winning immunity at the final 4, and while she wasn't winning by that point anyway, she gets tricked by Tommy into taking him over Lauren and pissing off Lauren in the process. So really, I feel like Nora's game is just a really turbulent one, where while she is technically voting in the majority for a decent chunk of her run, she's also barely scraping by for a lot of it. She rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. She had no win equity by the end of it, but even then, had to get lucky by Dan getting ejected, and she made plenty of actively bad decisions at opportunities where she could have flipped the game to her benefit. So at the end of the day, I feel like Nora is someone who played such an actively bad game that it's really hard to have her too much higher here than number 77. Now moving on to number 76, and sort of similar to Nora, this is another person that wasn't necessarily on the outs for a lot of the game. However, they also actively blew up their game by the end of it. But number 76, we do have Kelly Wigglesworth, the original runner-up of Survivor. And Kelly was a really weird player to assess. I did consider having her a bit higher, if I'm being honest, simply because she was in a very strong position for a decent chunk of the game. I would say that for the first 2/3 of the game, she was pretty clearly within the majority alliance, which I feel like is more than what I can say for Nora or even some of the people that we'll be talking about relatively soon. However, I think she also completely blows up her game for no real reason by the end of it that causes her to be all the way towards the bottom here. Now, like I said, she was in a very solid spot early on where, while people give Richard Hatch a lot of the credit for creating the alliance nowadays, in reality, it was Kelly and Sue that were involved in alliance making early on, where on the original Tagi tribe, we see them being part of the Women's Alliance along with Stacy Stillman, and while she loses Stacy relatively early, they're able to build a new alliance immediately afterwards, pulling in Rich and Rudy that ends up becoming the Tagi Alliance moving forward, and then we see them like being able to slowly build a majority. Where at the merge, they're able to take advantage of the Pagongs not wanting to work together. And through the Dr. Sean votes, they effectively get the majority by the time of the final 8. And up until the final 6, I do think Kelly's game is not that bad if I'm being honest. But the problem is that Kelly completely blows up her game, where she decides to distance herself from the Tagi Alliance, going against them but not even working with the Bagongs to take out the Tagis. It's not like she's going to Colleen or Sean to try to flip the game on the original Tagis. She's just simply declaring herself a lone wolf and not caring what other people do. In the sense of making herself a massive target moving forward, where she essentially has to win out from the final 6, winning 4 immunities in a row, where she probably goes home at any of those tribals if she doesn't win those immunities. And again, it's entirely her own fault, where she could have just sat back and had a relatively smooth ride to the end, but instead she has to distance herself from the Tagis and make herself a target in the process. And even while she's at the bottom, she's still making mistakes, where at the final 4, you have her flipping on Sue on the revote, after voting with Sue initially on the vote for no real reason. Like, it's unclear why she votes out Sue at that point, and it just pisses off Sue to the point where Sue is actively against her at Final Tribal. You also have her not having much win equity either, where despite her being this underdog that is winning these immunities at the end, she still doesn't really have that much respect at the end, where while it ends up being a 4-3 jury vote, we learned afterwards that it was actually going to be a 5-2 vote at least, if not a 6-1 vote coming to Final Tribal, where Colleen and Jervis supposedly flipped due to the Snakes and Rats speech, which has nothing to do with what Kelly actively did. So really, I find Kelly's game here to be really rocky, where while her first 2/3 are pretty good, I feel like the back third is so actively bad, with her blowing up her game, her voting out Sue at the final 4, her not really having much win equity despite her being this underdog. I feel like these things are such major knocks to me that I have to drag her here all the way down to number 76. Now moving on to number 75, and we have another player who on paper doesn't play the worst game in the world. However, if we consider how they got to the end, I think it is incredibly wonky, but we actually have Kim Johnson from Survivor Africa. And again, Kim is someone who on paper doesn't play the worst game in the world, where they are in the majority for most of their run. Now, mind you, they're never in the core power structure on the Baran tribe, but there's very few points before the end of the game where they're on the outs or being targeted. Where early on, they're able to avoid the initial target of being an older woman and are able to take out Diane and Jessica Macho without too much difficulty. After the swap, they're able to hold strong, taking out Silas after throwing the immunity challenge. And then after the merge, Baran gets numbers and they're able to have a relatively smooth ride to the end of the game, voting the majority for most of those rounds and never really being a direct target during a lot of those situations. Where they only get 1 vote against them the entire season, that being during the Frank round, but that was a pretty cut and dry tribal anyway. But after all the Sambrus are gone, Kim does become the key target, where she's the only person left outside the core alliance of Ethan, Tom, and Lex, and she would have been voted out at both the Final 4 and Final 3 rounds had she not won immunity there. And that alone is really bad, as Kim clearly had the least amount of win equity by that point, and the fact that none of Ethan, Tom, or Lex want to take her to the end as an easy beat is already pretty bad. But I think the thing that really drags her to the bottom of the list is how she wins the Final 4 and Final 3 immunities. Where at the Final 4, the challenge is Fallen Comrades, and Kim ends up winning this on a question that had multiple correct answers, where production ended up giving her the point over Lex, even though Lex also gave an answer that was technically correct, and production simply didn't realize that the question they gave had multiple correct answers, and really that challenge should have gone to a tiebreaker, and had Kim lost that tiebreaker, she would have been voted out there, but instead she ends up getting the win instead. And then we get the Final 3 immunity, which is Hands on a Hard Idol, and she also wins that due to weird circumstances, where despite her being the physically weakest of Lex and Ethan, you have her winning after Ethan drops out due to being distracted by seeing a production member off screen, vomiting due to the intense heat that was happening that day, and you have Lex dropping out due to him being sick that day. So I do think she gets pretty lucked out by how she wins that challenge as well. And really, the fact that she wins both these challenges in such weird ways makes it very hard for her to be this much higher, considering that she was supposed to be voted out at both the Final 4 and Final 3 challenges. Not to mention that she has no win equity at the end, where she would have lost to all three of Tom, Lex, and Ethan. So I do think at the end of the day, I think her end game is really wonky, and the fact that she got to the end the way that she does is really what drags her all the way down towards the bottom here. Where I feel like if it wasn't for that, she would be quite a bit higher on the list, if I'm being honest, where she doesn't really make any major blunders in the game, and I think her biggest issue is just not really being in the driver's seat. But I think it's the fact that she gets towards the end in a really fluky way in a spot to where she would have been cut otherwise is what really drags her all the way towards the bottom here at number 75. Now moving on to number 74, and we're kind of out of this very bottom tier of players who were voted out and had to come back in, or players who played actively bad, or players who really had wonky circumstances in how they got to the end. And we're kind of now into players who were really towards the bottom for a lot of their run here. It's just a matter of ordering them. But number 74, and I actually feel really bad for having this person so low, but we actually have a pretty recent runner-up, and that person is Jake O'Kane from Survivor 45. And again, I really like Jake, and I think he's someone who at least is aware of the game, and I think he's someone who at least recognized what he should be doing at multiple opportunities, but he was still pretty much at the bottom for almost the entire season and failed at just about everything he tried to do. Where early on, he's towards the bottom of the original Bellow tribe, would have been the first boot had they gone to that first tribal, and while I was able to gain a little bit of traction as the rounds went on and Bruce became a bigger target, he was still at the bottom during that entire stretch. You have the swap where he does build a relationship with Caleb and probably would have been in an interesting spot had they gone to that tribal, but they simply never do. And then from the merge on, he's put right back at the bottom and is never able to gain much traction afterwards, where he fails to keep Caleb around at the split tribal, loses Caleb there. He fails to keep the bellows together as they're fracturing and being taken out, and he ends up being a secondary target at a lot of these tribals during the Kelly round, during the Kendra round, during the Bruce round even. With the Bruce round, he would have been taken out had Bruce used his idol, which he was pretty close to doing, and has almost nothing to do with getting Bruce to not use his idol there. He's out of the loop during the Emily round, the final 7, though to be fair, most of the tribe was, but whatever. You go to the final 5, where he tries to make this really big move and blindsiding D and using his idol on Katura, but ends up sketching out Katura to the point where she backs out of the plan and votes out Julie instead, and the plan just completely blows up in Jake's face. And then you have him being unable to stay out of fire at Final 4, despite him being the biggest GOAT by that point. And again, I do think a lot of people like Jake on a personal level. A lot of them kind of felt bad for him, if I'm being honest, but it was just never going to translate to game respect. I don't think Jake wins in really any scenario by the end of the game, unless it was like a final 2 with him and Bruce, but I mean, that was never happening. But I think Jake's game here is incredibly rocky, where he's just at the bottom for so much of the season. There being multiple rounds where he's just out of the loop and being targeted, even though he's a non-threat. You have him just failing at everything he's trying to do, like the final 5 move, even the final 6 move where he tries to check out Drew doesn't play out the way that he wants to. Him trying to keep Halo around, just failing. I mean, there's just so many things that just go wrong for Jake across the season. And while I do like Jake on a personal level, it's just not enough to keep him too much higher here. So because of that, he's here at number 74. Now moving on to number 73, and we actually have another new era runner-up, which I wasn't really expecting, but it's just how the list played out. But number 73, we do have Romeo from Survivor 42. And I think Romeo also played a really bad game, especially in the post-merge. Now, I will say that his pre-merge is considerably stronger than Jake's, where he was at least in the majority during the pre-merge, being essentially Drea's second in command, where he was in the majority during both the Zach Ortenberger and Swati rounds. Mind you, I think he doesn't really get his way in the Zach round, where I think he would have tried to keep Zach, and I think losing Zach is not ideal for his position. But he's still in the majority during both those rounds. But the main reason he's so low on the list is his post-merge, which I think is really bad when you really look at it, where despite him working alongside Drea for pretty much the entire pre-merge, he's left out of the majority alliance that gets formed at that merge, where Drea is pulled into like this big threats alliance that ends up driving a lot of the game, but she doesn't even bother to pull Romeo into it. And this really causes Romeo to really be on the outs for so much of the post-merge, where during the Lydia round, he ends up voting for Marianne. During the Chanel round, he ends up being targeted by the minority and doesn't even vote out Chanel there, where he ends up throwing his vote into High, which is pretty funny there. During the split tribal, he does vote out Roxroy, but it was a unanimous vote, and Roxroy voted for him, so again, he's once again being targeted. During the High round, he votes for Jonathan. During the Drea round, he votes for Mike. It's really insane just how out of the loop he is for so much of the post-merge, which is even crazier considering that he was working with Drea, who ends up being part of the majority alliance in the post-merge. Now, we do get to the final six where he does finally start to find a group where he ends up working with Marianne and is part of the eventual Omer blindside. However, he was also the split plan at that vote, where you had the likes of Mike and Jonathan throwing their votes onto Romeo in case Lindsay used her amulet on Omer, and he would have been taken out there had she done so, but ends up not doing so. And while he does vote out Lindsay at Final 5, wins immunity at Final 4, takes Marianne to the end, he wasn't winning in any scenario anyway. Now, I think there's a chance he could get some votes against Jonathan and Omer, even though I think Omer probably wins that. However, I just think Romeo's game in the post merge is historically bad. I can't really wrap my head around just how much he's just out of the loop before that final six round. It is such a terrible stretch of gameplay for him. And even at the final six, while he is part of this big move, the move of the season, it was still in a spot to where he would have gone home had Lindsay played her amulet. So at the end of the day, I feel like Romeo's game is really bad. Definitely a bottom tier game for me. The reason he is above Jake, though, is that he did at least play a good pre-merge. He was at least in the majority during the pre-merge, where Jake was pretty much on the bottom for the entire game. But I think Romeo's game is still pretty bad to where he's here at number 73. Now moving on to number 72, and this player was in the majority for much more of the game compared to Jake or Romeo, but is still a really bad game when you look at it, and that person is Cassandra from Survivor Fiji. And I think Cassandra's game is also pretty bad for the most part. Now, the major pro to give her is that she was in the majority for most of her run. Early on, she was able to align with Earl and Dreams, and once that group gets together after the swap, they're really able to take control for the rest of the game. Though I think within that, there's plenty of rockiness as well, where before the swap, when she's on the original Moto, she's towards the bottom of that group, and when they eventually go to Tribal, she's the only person to not vote for Liliana, while Liliana votes for her. That's pretty bad. And even after the merge, when she's part of the majority alliance, and while she is well positioned within that majority alliance to get towards the end of the game, she's not only one of the least involved players in the strategy that alliance makes, but is also a target by the four horsemen, where during the Agardo round, you have the three horsemen putting their votes onto Cassandra despite her being this non-threat in the game. And for Cassandra to draw the target on her back, despite her not really doing much in the game, is a pretty bad indictment to her game. And while she's able to vote in the majority for most of her run and is able to largely avoid the target after the Agardo round, she's still not really doing much, and it's just kind of riding the wave for a lot of it. I think the Final Four is another major knock to her game, where you have Yao Man fighting for his life after Dreams wins immunity, but despite Earl being right there as an option to be taken out, you have Yao Man deciding to target Cassandra instead, and pitching Cassandra to Dreams to be taken out. And the fact that Cassandra is being targeted over Earl is really insane in my eyes, considering how massive of a threat Earl is, and considering just how little Cassandra did during the course of the season. And obviously, while it doesn't go through, and she really has no chance of winning in the final three, I do think a minor pro you can give her is that she would have won in a final two against Dreams. I mean, that's something at least. But it's not like Cassandra really did much to get that to happen to begin with. And even in a final two, like, I feel like this jury would not have been happy with Cassandra anyway, as it seemed like a lot of jury just didn't respect her on any level. So I do think at the end of the day, I think Cassandra's game is really bad. And while she was in the majority for a lot of her run, it was in a spot to where she not only did almost nothing to propel that alliance, but was still being targeted at points where she probably should not have. So I think it's those major knocks that leave her so low on the list to where she's here at number 72. Now moving on to number 71, and we're going back now to one of these players who was out of the loop for a decent chunk of their game, but they do actually manage to turn it on a bit towards the end, even though it wasn't enough for them to win. But we're actually going back to the new era for this one, and here we have Xander from Survivor 41. And I did consider having Xander a little bit higher, considering he at least had an okay end game, and I feel like that alone was enough to have him above some of these other people. But I feel like the first 2/3 of his game are pretty bad for the most part, where he's really on the bottom, barely surviving for a lot of it. Early on, he's on the bottom of the original Yase tribe, and while he does vote correctly at that first tribal to take out Abraham, it really does set him up to be in a pretty bad spot coming to the next round, where it's essentially between him and Voce over who's the next to go. And I feel like he largely survives that round due to him having found the Beware advantage that caused him to lose his vote, and it just made him the easier person to save off for another round, considering if they were to vote out Voce first, then it would just be easier to vote out Xander next compared to the other way around. So I do feel like he kind of gets lucky that he had found that advantage to begin with. But regardless, he would have been voted out had they ever gone back to Tribal in the pre-merge. And then we get to the merge where he's once again on the bottom, where despite the Yase being picked off one by one, Xander himself is not really able to integrate within the majority group, as he's lumped in with the likes of Evie and Tiffany for the next couple of rounds, And while he is involved in the knowledge is power play at the Sydney round that causes Liana to waste her knowledge is power, which in turn causes the scrambling to happen that eventually results in Sydney going out, I feel like Xander's still at the bottom after the round anyway, where he loses Tiffany in the next round and then loses Evie at the split tribal. And I feel like he also wastes an opportunity at that round to use his extra vote or an idol to save Evie there, as I feel like had he been able to do so, he would have been in a better spot coming into the final 8 there. But I think this game does turn around at the final 8, where at that point we do see the likes of Ricard and Erica being willing to flip the game onto Shan, Danny, and Deshawn. And Xander is pulled into that, where he does align with Ricard and Erica. And from that point on, he is part of the majority group, where he is able to take out Shan at the final 8, Leon at the final 7, Danny at the final 6, and does have the wherewithal to flip on Ricard at the final 5, taking out a pretty big threat there. And while I wouldn't give Xander that much credit for a lot of these moves, he is at least involved in these moves happening. Though I do think he kind of has a misstep at the very end of the game where he does win final immunity and decides to not put Erica into fire, simply because he was worried that doing so would have given Erica this extra move for her resume, and he was worried about Erica being this big jury threat, which I do think is not the right way to go about it. I feel like if he really thought Erica was as big of a jury threat as she seemed, that he would have been better off trying to get Erica out through fire making. But instead, he does allow Erica to get to the end where he just blatantly loses to her. So I do feel like he kind of drops the ball at the very end of the game. And in general, I find Xander's game very rocky, where I feel like the first 2/3 of his game are really bad in my personal opinion, where he's just barely surviving during a lot of it. And even at the end of the game, where he is like part of the majority of the group taking out these big threats, I still wouldn't consider him that big of a power player. So I do think those things kind of even out to him being relatively low in this runner-up ranking, even though at the time a lot of people were pretty high on him. But I feel like for me, I feel like 71 is about as high as I can put him. Now moving on to number 70, and we actually have yet another New Era runner-up, and here we have Owen Knight from Survivor 43. And I think Owen's game is not that dissimilar from Xander's in the sense that he has a really bad stretch in the middle, but is kind of able to turn it around by the end of it. Now, I do think his early game is probably a bit better than Xander's, where he's at least part of the majority group, where he seemed to have a good enough relationship with Ellie and Janine. Also was able to build a bond with Sammy and Gabler that's able to keep him pretty safe during a lot of the pre-merge there, which I think is a massive boon there over Xander. But after the merge, the wheels do come off for him, and he spends a decent amount of the game on the bottom, where first up, he is blindsided at the Ellie round, which is not great for him there. He's then on the outs during the Dwight round, another case of him losing one of his allies. He does vote out Janine the following round, but that was a number from his side. Now he is able to turn it around at the split tribal, where his side does have the numbers in that split, and he is pulled into this plan by Sammy and Noelle to blindside James, which is all pretty good there, even though it does involve him having his vote stolen, and he also gets into a conflict with James that makes him the target from James, to where had the plan gone wrong, he would have been in some danger there, but he is technically able to be part of the majority for that. However, he's then blindsided again the following round, where he does lose Noelle due to Noelle becoming this big threat. And again, I feel like a lot of his early merge is pretty bad, where he's constantly being left out and he's being compared to Charlie Brown. But similar to Xander, I think Owen's endgame is a bit better in my opinion, where at the final 7, he is pulled back into the majority, where he does make a final 3 deal with Cassidy and Gabler, and through their connection to Jesse, he is able to be in the majority for the rest of the game, where at the final 7, they take out Sammy, final 6, he is part of the Cody blindside, and at final 5, he is also part of the Carlo blindside, which is pretty good there. And through his connection with Cassidy and Gabler, he's essentially guaranteed a spot at the end, only for him to lose. And supposedly he thought that it was going to be a battle between him and Cassidy, only for him to realize at the end that he just simply had no win equities. So I did find that a little bit funny. But in a lot of ways, I think Owen's game is pretty similar to that of Xander's, where he is in a pretty bad spot during a lot of the earlier merge, only for it to turn around in the end game. But even then, I do think even the points where he was in the majority at the end, he doesn't really have much agency. Or even with the Cody and Carla blindsides, I feel like he doesn't really have much to do with those. Even the James blindside, the split tribal, I feel like that was more so the work of Noelle and Sammy. And mixing that in with the fact that he was just completely on the bottom during the early merge, it does make out for a pretty rocky game, and a big reason why he's relatively low on this list. The reason I do have him above the likes of Xander is I feel like he was a lot safer in the game than Xander, where he was at least in an okay spot during the pre-merge, and even when he was on the outs during the post-merge, I feel like he wasn't really in direct danger going home himself in a lot of situations. So I do feel like those things were enough to have him above Xander, and definitely some of these other bottom tier New Era runners up. But at the end of the day, I feel like his game is still pretty bad to where he's here at number 70. Now moving on to number 69, and we have another person who was kind of in and out of the majority and was definitely blindsided at multiple points, and that person is Julie from Survivor Edge of Extinction. And Julie is kind of in a similar ballpark where, while there were plenty of points in the game where she was in the majority, there were also points where she was just blindsided. And I feel like by the end of it, she didn't really have that much agency in how the game played out. Now, early on, she does seem to be in a good spot in the original Kama tribe, and while they never go to tribal in the pre-merge, it did seem like she had pretty good relationships with the likes of Ron and Eric, to where she would have been pretty safe had they ever gone to tribal there. But then we get to the merge, which, as I alluded to a moment ago, is kind of all over the place here, where first up, she is part of the majority to take out Joe at that first vote, the Kamas did together, but then she's blindsided almost immediately afterwards, where the Kamas fracture and they take out Eric. She's not included in that plan, but she is able to recover afterwards, where her and Ron are able to reconnect with Rick Devens, and they are a part of the Julia plan the following round, and they're able to become the swing votes the following round, where they're pulled into this alliance with the old Lesus while still having Devens and David, and they do eventually decide to take out David at the final 10, but then they're blindsided again at the final 9, where Wardog flips and takes out Kelly Wentworth. That's pretty bad. And while they're able to take out Wardog at the final 8, we then get to the final 7, where Julie is blindsided yet again, this time losing Ron, her closest ally throughout the game. That's pretty bad. And while she has a pretty smooth ride afterwards, having a pretty safe road to the end, it's in a spot to where she has almost no win equity, and sure enough, she's eventually taken to the end without much to do there. So at the end of the day, I'm very conflicted over where to have Julie here, where on one hand, there are definitely points where she was in the majority, particularly during that David round and even during the Wardog round at the final 8. But even then, I always felt like she was a second in command to Ron, where it never felt like Julie herself was getting her way at a lot of points. And considering just how much she was blindsided in the post-merge, and considering that she had no win equity, and considering there aren't really that many moves I can give Julie that much credit for, I feel like I can't really have her that much higher than number 69. Now moving on to number 68, and we have yet another person who I wasn't really sure what to do with. I considered having them higher, I considered having them lower, but I think 68 is a good spot to have Matt Van Erfeldt from Survivor at the Amazon. And Matt is a pretty confusing player. I wasn't really sure what to make of them, as there are many points where he's towards the bottom, but I think there are also some impressive elements to his game that leave him above some of these other players who are also at the bottom. Now, like I said, I think his early game is pretty rough, where he's pretty clearly towards the bottom of the men's tribe there, where he's on the outs during the Ryan Aiken round, where he votes for Roger there. Also loses Daniel Liu in a spot to where Daniel Liu is one of his allies. And I do think had they ever gone back to tribal, he would have been in a pretty bad spot there. And I think that kind of carries over to the swap as well, where while he is able to integrate to where he survives over Shauna, he was also the backup target there, and it was at 42 votes, so that's kind of hairy. And even after the merge, while I think he is part of the majority during a lot of those votes, voting correctly at a lot of those tribals, I think he's also not really in the driver's seat for a lot of it. And I feel like his main saving grace in the game was his relationships to Butch and Rob's sister Nino there. But then we get to the final 7, where we do see the Jenna, Alex, Heidi, and Christy side planning to flip the game against him, which is pretty bad. However, we later see Rob decide to flip the game on them instead, where they are able to orchestrate this massive Alex blindside there, even though Matthew was the backup target and it was a 4-3 vote, pretty close there. But I think from that point on, I do think Matthew is clearly part of the majority group, where he's working alongside Rob's sister Nino, has a pretty clean ride to the end after that point. And I do think he makes a bit of an interesting move at the final 3, where we do see him throwing the final 3 immunity so that he doesn't have to betray Rob, and knowing that Jenna would have voted out Rob had she won immunity, which ends up happening. Though at the same time, I do think Matthew was going to lose to both Rob and Jenna at that point, so I do think that's pretty bad. And in general, I feel like Matthew's someone who didn't really have that much respect from a jury. It seemed like a lot of people just found him kind of creepy and weird. But I do think there are some impressive elements to Matthew's game. The fact that he had this relationship with Rob Nino that really was able to keep him safe during a lot of the game and allowed him to be in a pretty strong spot towards the end of the game. But I still think there were enough points where he was in danger or towards the bottom of the majority group that I can't have him too much higher than this point. But I still think there's enough there for Matthew to be here at number 68. Now moving on to number 67, and we're moving on to yet another person who didn't really have a lot of agency throughout a lot of the game, and there were definitely points where they were on the outs, but I do feel like they definitely had allies, and through that had a somewhat clear path to the end, and that person is Troyzan, and this is obviously his game from Survivor Game Changers. And Troyzan was another person who was pretty underwhelming for the most part. I know a lot of people were pretty down on him after Game Changers. And to be fair, I think his game here is mostly mediocre here, where while he is technically part of the majority for a decent chunk of the game, he's also someone who doesn't really have a lot of agency, and there were still points where he was on the outs anyway. But I think for a lot of the season, he's just kind of there, not really driving a lot of the action, even though he is part of the majority for both the Sierra and Tony rounds. And after that, he never really goes back to tribal until the merge, where from that point on, he does align with the likes of Brad Culpepper and Sierra Don Thomas, and they are in the majority for the Haley and Aussie blind sides, but after that, the game flips on them, where they are blindsided at the W round, where they try to target Andrea, don't get their way there. And while they are part of the Zeke plan, where they split the vote onto Ty, we then had them being blindsided once again at the final 9, where they lose Sierra, one of their allies there. Though I think after that, he is technically part of the majority thereafter, where they do pick up Sarah Lucina, and through that, they end up running a lot at the end game. Though we also get to the final 6 round, which is kind of a wonky situation for him, where you have all these people playing advantages, and Trorizan does technically have to use his idol at that point to at least save himself from a rock draw against Suri, but that is technically a point in the game where he is kind of in danger, but that was kind of due to wonky circumstances. And from that point on, his group does drive the rest of the game, but it's in a spot to where Trorizan himself is probably the least involved in what his group is doing. And considering he doesn't really have much win equity at the end, I feel like there isn't really that much to praise with Trorizan's game at the end of the day. But the reason he is above some of these other people is that I feel like he was technically in the majority for more of the game compared to a lot of these other people. But there are still plenty of points where his side loses out on certain votes. And even when they are in control, I feel like Trorizan doesn't really get much credit for a lot of the moves that his side is making, where I feel like the likes of Brad Culpepper and Sarah Lucina deserve way more credit for what their group is doing, where I feel like Trorizan is just kind of a tag along for a lot of the game. So I feel like for those reasons, I can't really have many higher than number 67. Now moving on to number 66, and we have someone who's actually pretty similar to Trorizan in a lot of ways, and they're from the season immediately before Game Changers, but we do have Ken from Survivor Millennials versus Gen X. And I think Ken has a lot of similarities to Trorizan, where I feel like he's someone who is technically aligned with people who are running decent chunks of the game, where in this case, he is shown being aligned with the likes of David Wright, who is a major power player across the season. And I feel like Ken is mostly safe throughout the game as well, where there are very few points where he's being actively targeted. However, with that, I feel like Ken is also someone who doesn't really have much agency in how the game is playing out, and doesn't really have much input in what David is doing, but more so just going along with David as a number there. Now, he is in the majority early on the original Gen X tribe, where he is part of the majority for both the Rachel and Paul Walker rounds. Though I do think the Lucy round is a bit more wonky, where he is technically voting for Jessica in that round, a spot to where Jessica was one of his numbers there. And I feel like the fact that he was willing to let go Jessica was not particularly great, but it kind of works out for him due to David playing an idol at that point. But I do feel like moving forward, I think Ken is able to remain the majority again, where he's able to pull an Adam at the swap to ensure that they have the numbers to take out Figgy. And then after the merge, he is once again part of the majority alliance, and he's mostly able to hold on to that. Now, there are points where they don't get their way, like you have the rock draw at the final 10, where his side does technically lose out on that vote, and while his side is able to regain the numbers following round by taking out Zeke, that has almost nothing to do with what Ken's doing. If anything, Ken does actively bad work in this round by testing Will, which obviously upsets Will to the point where Will almost votes against them, but they are able to get around that. But after the final 9, it is a mostly smooth ride to the end for Ken, where he is in the majority for the rest of the game. And while he does eventually flip against David at the final 4 to take him out, it's in a spot to where the jury gives him almost no credit for the move, where they think Adam was the one to convince Ken to flip, even though he was already willing to do so. And in general, I don't think the jury really respected Ken to where I don't think he wins across many scenarios in my eyes. So it's still a pretty interesting game where on one hand, he is in the majority for most of his run, and he is technically aligned with a power player in David. But I feel like Ken has almost nothing to do with what David's doing, and I feel like I give David almost sole credit for what his alliance is able to do across a lot of the season, where I feel like Ken is just kind of there. So for those reasons, I don't really have him very high in this ranking. The reason he's above Trorizan is that I feel like he was more consistently in the majority for more of the game compared to Trorizan, where I feel like there were points in the earlier game where Trorizan was kind of on the outs. But I feel like the fact that Ken was more consistently in the majority wasn't enough to have him above him at number 66. Now moving on to number 65, and I feel like this person is also kind of in the same category as being part of a dominant alliance, however, not really having much agency within that alliance. But at number 65, we do have Mick from Survivor Samoa. And I think Mick's kind of in a similar ballpark, where he is technically aligned with the FOA 4, and that is able to remain the majority group for pretty much the entire post-merge, even though they came into the merge really down in numbers here. Now, I think early on, there is some wonkiness here, like the fact that he was technically on the outs during the Marisa vote where he votes for Ashley there. That's not great. And while he is voting in the majority afterwards, I don't think he's really having much agency in how those votes are playing out. And if anything, he is kind of seen as a joke, which admittedly is in part due to him having been selected as a leader at the beginning of the game, but not really living up to that role. But I do feel like for the most part, Mick is still voting within the majority there. And then coming to the merge, his tribe is down in numbers significantly, but they are able to chip away at that. They're able to eventually overcome a 4-8 disadvantage, which on paper is pretty impressive, but I feel like Mick was the least involved in getting that to go through, where I feel like the likes of Russell, even Natalie, were more involved in getting a lot of those plans to go through, where I feel like Mick was just kind of there and kind of seen as a non-threat there, but he's able to ride away, being able to be involved in a lot of these rounds, voting out the Galoos one by one, only to be stymied by Brett's immunity win towards the end that eventually causes the Fofos to turn on each other at the final five, voting out Jason there, and supposedly Mick was going to be the target at final four had Brett won immunity there, which is obviously pretty bad. And despite this, Mick doesn't even win at the end, where he's clearly the least respected of the jury there, where you have Shambo calling him feckless. In general, I feel like Mick is someone who probably doesn't win in many scenarios there. Now, I know there are some rumors out there that Mick could have beaten Russell in the final two, or if there was like Shambo or Jason being able to sneak in there, that Mick could have beaten Russell there. However, I just don't really buy that. Or even though the perception is that Russell lost to a bitter juror in Samoa, I think there are definitely people that would have voted him over Mick in a lot of scenarios, as I just don't think Mick was that big of a jury threat by the end of it. So at the end of the day, I feel like Mick is still someone who kind of fits in line with Troyzen and Ken, these people that were part of these majority alliances that drove a lot of the game, was never really on the outs during many points of the game, but despite that, had almost no agency in how that alliance really drove a lot of the action in the game. And I felt there aren't really many impressive elements to his game, and there really isn't much win equity either, to where he's still here at number 65. Now moving on to number 64, and we're rounding out this bottom tier here with two people from the same season actually, and we're just ordering them. But number 64, we do have Philip Shepard from Survivor Redemption Island, and I do think Philip played a pretty bad game for the most part here, and I'm sure there are plenty of people who think he should be even lower here than what I have him here. The main reason he is as high as he is he is technically in the majority for almost the entire game, where yes, he is on the outs initially, where he's kind of seen as pretty annoying and seen as his unreliable ally. You have Francesca and Christina trying to pick him up to blindside Boston Rob, only for him to blow up the Planet Tribal. But after that, he is picked up by Boston Rob, where Boston Rob does include him into the alliance, and while he is technically towards the bottom of the alliance on paper, I think Boston Rob made it pretty clear that he wanted to take Philip towards the end as an easy beat, which is obviously one of the big issues in the sense that Philip is someone who simply couldn't win the game, and moving forward, he does things that aggravate a lot of the players in the game, where you have him get into conflicts with the people in his tribe. After the merge, you have the whole Rice War situation, which is a pretty bad look there. Again, I think Philip does pretty bad social work. I don't think he wins the game in really any scenario here, and I think that's a big reason why he was part of the majority alliance for as much of the game as he was. But at the end of the day, he was still in the majority alliance for almost the entire game, where he is voting alongside Boston Rob for all of it. And while it didn't seem like he was ever going to flip on Boston Rob, and I don't think he really does anything to drive the strategy in that alliance, the fact that he was in the majority for as much of the game as he was is a major reason why he is as high as he is. But obviously, he's still a pretty bad player, someone who obviously couldn't win the game at the end, and it's for that reason that he's here at number 64. Now moving on to number 63, and we have the other runner-up from Redemption Island, and here we have Natalie Tenorelli. And I think Natalie's kind of in a similar boat to Philip in the sense that she was kind of dragged through the game by Boston Rob as this person who is going to remain loyal to him, and I think she does things that really harm her perception, like the fact that she was pretty young out there, the fact that she didn't really do anything to differentiate herself. And you obviously have, towards the end game, you have Ashley trying to convince Natalie to flip against Boston Rob, but Natalie not only didn't go along with it, but even leaked this information to Boston Rob. But I think a lot of that's pretty bad. Sort of similar to Philip, I don't think she really wins in many scenarios, where while you could argue that she wins a final three against Andrea and Philip, I think beyond that, I think she's someone that the jury was never really looking at that highly. I don't think she really does much across the game, and it's just kind of there for the ride. But similar to Philip, she is in the majority for pretty much the entire game, and is actually in the majority right from the beginning of the game, which is part of the reason why I have her above Philip to begin with. Then also, I think she probably wins in a final two against Philip, so I think she had slightly more win equity compared to Philip as well, even though Philip does technically get a jury vote at the end, but whatever. But I do feel like Philip and Natalie are kind of in a similar boat, really epitomizing this group of players who were in the majority for most of their runs and were part of the majority alliances there, but just simply had no agency within that and had no jury respect within that. But I do feel like the fact that Natalie was in the majority for pretty much the entire game and technically had a bit more win equity on paper compared to Philip was enough to have her here at number 63. Now moving on to number 62, and we are kind of moving on to a different grouping of players now. These are all players who admittedly are more similar to the players we already talked about compared to players we'll be talking about in the next grouping. But the main thing separating them is that these are all players who actually had win equity at the end, or players who came somewhat close to winning and was just a matter of ordering them. But number 62, we definitely had the player who had the rockiest road to the end, and here we have Michelle Fitzgerald, and this is obviously her game from Winners at War. And I wasn't entirely sure what to do with Michelle here, as I feel like her game on the season is pretty rocky, and in many ways more of the same from her original season. But I feel like there are some slight pros to her that leave her a bit higher than the people we already talked about here. Now, she is blindsided right away at the first tribal of the season, losing Natalie there, which is obviously not a great look. And she is initially at the bottom, but I do feel like she does pretty good work afterwards in building relationships with the rest of the Celes and is able to be part of the majority afterwards, taking out Danny and Ethan there. So I do feel like she does pretty good work on her starting try despite her bad start. And it carries over to the swap as well, where she is swapped into a very good position, being with a lot of people she had pre-game relationships with. And obviously, while pre-game does play a factor into that, she is still in a pretty powerful position there, where first up she's able to get the fire tokens from Parvati after she's voted out, and is a key swing vote during the Yule Tribal, so I feel like those are all pretty good rounds of gameplay for her there. But after the merge, I think her game becomes a lot more turbulent, where first up she does lose Wendell, that's not good for her game there. And while she's voting in the majority for the next couple rounds, including that Sophie round, the final 9, I feel like Michelle's not really in the driver's seat for a lot of that, where I feel like other people are driving the action more than she is. And even with the Sophie plan at the final 9, she was one of the secondary targets at that tribal and was kind of forced to vote for Sophie because of that. But I feel like from the Kim round on, her game goes completely downhill, where from that point on, she is pretty blatantly at the bottom, not taking out any of her targets. And she's greatly benefited by Natalie coming back into the game at the final 6, to where had that not happened, she probably doesn't even get to the end unless she just completely wins out from that point, which, to be fair, she had already done and go wrong, but whatever. And even after Natalie comes back into the game, you had the final 5 round, where she was one of the main targets there, and probably would have gone home had Ben not asked Sarah to vote him out there, so I feel like that's completely wonky circumstance there. And like I said, I feel like her game here is not that dissimilar from her original season, where she came into an end game where she needed something outside of her control to allow her to get to the end, where on her original season it was Joe getting medevac at the final 5, and in this season it's Natalie coming back into the game. I feel like in general, I feel like Michelle was not set up well to get towards the end of the game, and obviously she does lose at the end. However, a major reason why she is as high on the list as she is that despite her not winning at the end, she actually had serious respect from a decent chunk of the jury here, where while she does technically end up being a 0-vote finalist at the end, there was a decent amount of jurors who were considering voting for her as a way of giving her second place, only for them to back out due to the fear that it would jeopardize Tony's chances of winning. But I feel like had she gotten to the end against someone other than Tony, that a lot of those people would have pulled the trigger and actually voted for her. So I do think Michelle actually had some win equity on this season, and even some winning scenarios where I think had she gone to the end against Ben and Denise, she probably wins that. So I do think Michelle actually had some win equity on this season, despite how rocky her game was. And that's a major reason why she's in this grouping of players. Players who played pretty flawed games or not very dominant games, but players who actually had some situations where they could have possibly won the game here. But again, I feel like Michelle had the rockiest road to actually getting to the final 3 to begin with, which is a big reason why she's here number 62. Now moving on to number 61, and we have another player who is only this high because they came close to winning, but if it wasn't for that, they would be much lower. And here we have Susie Smith from Survivor Gabon. And again, Susie does technically come 1 vote away from winning, where she only loses in a 4-3 jury vote against Bob, which I think says something there. But I feel beyond that, her game is not that impressive in my eyes, and she just kind of squeaks her way through a lot of the game here. Where again, early on, she is technically part of both the Michelle and Jillian votes in the original Fong tribe, but she's not really part of any major alliance over there. She's just kind of scraping on by there. After the swap, she's once again towards the bottom of her tribe. Probably would have voted out at a lot of tribals had they gone to them. And even at the one tribal they do go to, she does some pretty bad work and telling people that she was voting for Corinne, which caused the target to be on her, and kind of gets saved due to the perception that Dan had an idol from his time on Exile, so barely scrapes through that round. And then after that, she gets greatly benefited by the second swap that happens right before the merge that essentially pits her as the swing vote coming to the next tribal there. And she does take the opportunity to vote out Marcus, who was a pretty big power player in the game at that point, and voting him out really opens up the game for the Fongs to take control after the merge, which obviously benefits Susie. However, I don't really give Susie much credit for that, as I feel like the swap just naturally put her in that position to begin with. And plus, even after the merge, she's still not really doing much in the game. I feel like the likes of Crystal and Ken are way more active in how the game's playing out compared to anything Susie's doing. And I feel like a lot of her game afterwards is dictated by her following Maddie, who was another pretty big player within the game, and they do eventually flip against Crystal and Ken, taking them out back to back, only for her to become the main target coming to the final four, which is really insane there. The fact that Maddie wasn't even willing to take her to the end is really bad, in my opinion. But even after she wins immunity, she still wants to take Maddie to the end, someone who clearly would have beaten her at that point, and kind of gets lucked out by Sugar flipping to keep Bob around, which forces a fire making challenge, and she does get into her ideal final three of Sugar and Bob that allows her to get into the position to be one vote away from winning. And to be fair, she could have gotten that one extra vote from Randy, someone who Bob did actively mismanage, to where she could have gotten that vote there. But even so, it's not like a lot of the jury was happy with Susie, or really anyone from this final three for that matter. So I feel like in a lot of ways, while Susie does technically come close to winning, I feel like her path to the game is really unremarkable, to where there are just multiple points where she's just towards the bottom, and even when she's within the majority, she's not really doing that much at the end of the day. And even with her almost winning, even that is kind of due to fluky circumstances, like the fact that she had to win Final Four immunity, the fact that she fails in keeping Maddie around, the fact that Sugar decided to keep Bob around because Bob reminded her of her dad. I feel like there are even some luck-based circumstances within that, to where I did consider putting her lower on this list, simply due to how bad her game was. But at the end of the day, she did technically come close to winning. She did come close to winning there, and she was technically a swing vote at one point in the game. So I feel like those things were just enough to keep her in this grouping, but she's still pretty bad to where she's here at number 61. Now moving on to number 60, and I really did not know what to do with this person. I kind of went back and forth with where exactly to put this person, as this person does have plenty of win equity by the end of it. This person does come pretty close to winning. However, this person does have enough downsides to leave them around the middle of the pack on this grouping. By number 60, we do have Ozzy, and this is his game from Survivor Cook Islands. And I wasn't really sure what to make of Ozzy. I feel like there's definitely a debate for him being higher on the list, but I did decide to stick with him here simply because he wasn't really that well positioned for a lot of the game here. Now, he is part of the initial majority on the original I2 tribe. However, he does also decide to throw the second immunity challenge of the season in order to target Billy Garcia, and while he does succeed in that, I feel like it was also a pretty risky play that could have backfired on him, where we do have Billy trying to target him at that tribal, only for it to not go through. And considering how I feel like Billy could have just easily been taken out later, I feel like the fact that Ozzy went so far out of his way to throw that challenge so early is definitely a suboptimal play in my eyes, but he does technically get his way there. But then after the swap, he spends a lot of the game on the bottom, where he is blindsided at the Cecilia round. That's not particularly good. And while he does vote the majority to take out Cowboy and Flicka, he's not really that well positioned on the tribe, and he's more so being kept around due to challenge strength. Now, he is later part of this underdog alliance, the I-2-4, after the mutiny happens, which on paper is good for him, as they kind of need him around for challenge strength, where they do eventually win those next two immunity challenges, and through the ball twist, they come to the merge in a pretty advantageous position to take the numbers there. But I also feel like from a pure positioning standpoint, he is clearly on the outs there and probably would have been voted out had they ever lost one of those challenges, though again, considering his challenge strength, you never really know. But we do see the I2s taking the numbers after the merge, and Ozzy goes on a pretty insane immunity run, winning 5 out of the 6 immunity challenges, which on paper is good, the fact that he's able to be this dominant in challenges, but it also makes him a pretty clear target, to where I feel like he definitely needed those last couple immunities to get towards the end, to where had he lost Final 4 immunity, even Final 5 immunity, he probably gets voted out there, which is obviously not good there. And then you have the surprise Final 3 at the end, which I'm unsure over whether this is good or bad for Ozzy's game, as on one hand it's bad in the sense that it means that there's one less challenge that he has to win, and through that there's one less opportunity for him to be like a Terry Dietz, being sniped out right before the end. But on the other hand, I think it also kind of screws him over in the sense that it means that he never has a chance to take out Yule due to Yule's idol, which is good through the Final 4, and through that it means he has to go up against Yule at the end, who is a pretty tough person to beat in a jury vote there. But despite this, he actually comes pretty close to winning at the end, where he only loses in a 5-4 jury vote, where the deciding vote there was Adam, someone who was pretty open to voting for Ozzy in most situations, but voted for Yule due to this deal that he had made with Yule to vote out Penner before him. So I do think through that, Ozzy does get outplayed by Yule. But at the same time, the fact that he comes so close to winning against the biggest jury threat is pretty impressive in my eyes. So I feel like those things kind of elevate Ozzy to this grouping of players here. And there's definitely a debate for him being even higher at the end of the day. But I feel like the biggest issue with Ozzy is that he was just so dependent on his challenge train to get through the game, where I feel like during a lot of the pre-merge, he was kept around due to his challenge rank, despite him being towards the bottom of the pecking order there. You have the I-24, which is another situation where inherently he was not that well positioned with the people within that, but was seen as a necessity due to his challenge strength. And then after the merge, he pretty much wins out from the merge on, only losing one challenge there. So I feel like at the end of the day, I feel like Ozzy's game is really hard to assess because of that. But I feel like considering that he was so close to winning at the end, it was enough to keep him to his group of players, but not too much beyond that to where he's here number 60. Now moving on to number 59, and we have another player who I wasn't really sure what to do with. I considered having them a little bit higher, but at the end of the day, I feel like they kind of fit into this tier, and that is Will Sims from Survivor Worlds Apart. And Will's another person who I wasn't entirely sure what to make of here, as I do think there are some impressive elements to his game, but also some pretty not so great stuff, obviously. Early on, he's in a pretty good spot on the original No Collar tribe, and is actually a swing vote during the first Rebel they attend, where he initially had this alliance with Nina and Vince to blindside Jen, only for him to back out of it due to him not trusting Nina, and he does ultimately vote out Vince, which is kind of a questionable move, and puts him in a pretty precarious spot the next tribal, where it's between him and Nina, and only survives in a 3-2 vote, which is not great there. And then after the swap, he's once again in the majority, but even then, it's a secondary target, the one tribal they go to, but is able to be in the majority for that. And then we get to the merge where he was supposed to be part of this vote split plan between Haley and Jen, only for the majority to back out of it due to Mike not trusting Will, and which eventually backfires on them after Jen plays her idol there. So again, I think there's some not great stuff there on paper for Will. The fact that he was targeted quite a bit despite him being part of the majority, and also people not fully trusting him at certain rounds. But something I give Will quite a bit of credit for is that despite his original No Collar tribe being targeted and being on the bottom after the merge, he's actually able to avoid that, where he's able to build good enough bonds with the majority to where he's actually able to be part of the majority alliance moving forward. And while he's not really in the driver's seat for a lot of the post-merge, the fact that he's able to be part of the majority alliance in a position to where the rest of his tribe was being targeted and being on the bottom is a sign of good work in my eyes. Now, he does obviously burn Sharin along the way, and that entire situation is not the greatest look, obviously, and it really just harms his perception moving forward, but I do feel like he is still part of the majority and is able to be relatively safe for the rest of the game afterwards. And the reason he is in this tier is that despite him going up against Mike, who was his massive underdog in the endgame, Will actually came in the final tribal with 3 jury votes, where he supposedly would have gotten the votes of Tyler and Dan coming into that, only for Mike to flip them over at the last minute. But the fact that Will could have gotten that many jury votes, despite him being seen as a GOAT, is somewhat impressive in my eyes. But at the end of the day, I feel like Will played a pretty passive game, especially in that post-merge, where it very much felt like he was just following the likes of Carolyn and Rodney for a lot of it. Was enough to leave him relatively low on the list, but I feel like those pros were enough to leave him here at number 59. Now moving on to number 58, and we have someone who very much embodies his tier of players who were not very dominant, but were in a good spot and actually had some prospects by the end, and that is Courtney Yates from Survivor China. And I feel like Courtney very much fits into this tier, where she was pretty much in the majority alliance the entire game, where she aligned with Amanda and Todd very early on, and they pretty much have a clean ride to the end of the game as a result. Now, I feel like Courtney was by far the least integral to that group, where I very much felt like Amanda and Todd were way more involved in the actual strategy compared to anything Courtney did. And obviously that is a problem. That's a reason why she is relatively low on this list, whereas someone like Amanda is much higher in the list. But the reason Courtney is at least this high on the list is she actually got 2 jury votes at the end. She actually got 2nd place, which is somewhat impressive. And while you can argue that Denise and James were the only votes she was ever going to get in most situations, and also didn't really do much to cut Todd or Amanda along the way, I feel like the fact that she still got 2 jury votes at the end is somewhat impressive in my eyes. And also she was in the majority of the entire game, was never in danger, just had a pretty smooth ride from beginning to end. I feel like those things were enough to have her towards the top of this grouping, but beyond that, I feel like there isn't really much to say beyond that, which is why she's here at number 58. Now moving on to number 57, and we have the highest person in this grouping of players, and that is Wu Wang from Survivor Cagayan. And it was a debate for me between Courtney and Wu here, as I feel like Courtney was in the majority for way more of the game compared to Wu, where I feel like Wu was kind of in and out of the majority of points, and there were definitely some less impressive elements to his navigation through the game. But the reason Wu is at the top of this grouping is he is the most blatant winning scenario out of anyone here, and was probably the closest to actually getting that winning scenario out of anyone in this grouping. Now, if we are talking about the rest of his game, it's definitely rockier than someone like Courtney's, where early on he's on the original majority of the Braun tribe, where he's aligned with Cliff Robinson, though that ends up shifting later on, and we later see after the swap that he is on the outs when Cliff eventually gets taken out. That's not particularly great there. Now, he is part of the majority for the rest of the game afterwards, where he's essentially working alongside Tony and voting wherever Tony goes, where initially their tribe gets the numbers after the merge, taking out Sarah and take out Morgan thereafter. They then flip to take out LJ, and they vote out Jeremiah at the final 8. Mind you, who was the backup target there, and it is a 5-3 vote. That's not a great position there, but he then flips thereafter to take out Jeffra, takes out Tasha final 6, Trisha final 5, and they eventually take out Spencer final 4. Again, it's mostly just him working with Tony. I feel like Wu himself doesn't really have too much agency in how the game's playing out, and there's definitely a debate that he could have voted out Final 4 had Spencer won immunity there, so I do feel like Wu is not in the greatest spot for a lot of it, but he does get to a Final 3 with Cass and Tony, where both of them are taking him to the end. He has a winning scenario against Cass, and he ends up winning immunity himself to where he has the ability to make that choice. Where with one option, he wins the game against Cass, and in the other option, he loses against Tony. Though obviously the problem is he makes the wrong choice, where he's manipulated by Tony into taking him to the end due to him feeling like he had to be like a loyal player, and that if he votes out Tony that the jury won't respect him, which is just pretty ridiculous. And he even says in the episode that it would be the dumbest move ever for him to take Tony to the end, but yet here he is making the wrong choice. And that was obviously a major sticking point for me, where I actually considered having Wu lower, considering he does make the actively wrong choice at the end, and he is blatantly outplayed in a spot to where he wins the game otherwise. But at the end of the day, I feel like the fact that he just had that blatant winning scenario right in front of him, the fact that he was actually pretty close to having Cass winning immunity in the spot to where Cass would have made the choice for him and he wins the game anyway, I feel like the fact that he just comes the closest to winning out of anyone in this grouping of players was enough to have him at the top of this grouping, even though his game outside of that is not as strong as Courtney's, and the fact that he does technically make the wrong choice is definitely a mistake and obviously a reason to have him lower, but considering just how close he was to actually winning, I did decide to have him at the top of this tier to where he's here number 57. Now moving on to number 56, and we're now moving on to another grouping of players. These are players who were in pretty good positions for a decent chunk of the game, but also have decent chunks of the game where they're just completely on the outs and towards the bottom, and these are really inconsistent games, obviously. It's just a matter of ordering them. But number 56, we probably had the player who I was the least impressed by in terms of how dominant of a position they were in, and that is Jacqueline Schultz from Survivor San Juan del Sur. And Jacqueline, I think, pretty perfectly embodies this tier of someone who was in a pretty good position for a decent chunk of the game, but was also towards the bottom by the very end of it, where she actually starts off the game in a pretty rough position, where she's initially on the outs during the Nadia vote, where she was aligned with Nadia, only for Nadia to go out instead. She then tries to vote out Baylor, the next tribal, only for Val to go out instead. And while she does vote out John Rocker at the third tribal, I feel like it's pretty clear that she's not in the core majority alliance there, and probably would have been in some danger had they ever gone back to tribal. But then she gets a pretty good swap where she's reunited with her loved one in John Mish, and they are essentially able to become swing votes during both the tribals they attend, and they are pretty effective in taking out both the Wentworths back to back. And that carries over to the merge, where her and John are once again the swing votes, where they're between these two warring sides and the Josh and Jeremy side. And they actually are pretty effective in taking out the leaders of both alliances back to back, taking out Josh first, then Jeremy. After that, they are kind of in a precarious spot where you have Ree trying to pull in the outsiders to pull out this blindside against John, and they get really lucky where Keith blows up the Planet Tribal that eventually allows John to play the idol, to where otherwise there's a decent chance that she could have been blindsided there, but through Keith's bad gameplay, they are able to get through that round unscathed. Though it's around the final 7 that their grip on the game starts to weaken, where first at the final 7, they are on the outs during the Alec blindside, where the plan was to take out Keith, only for Natalie to flip at the last moment. And then the final 6, she finally loses John, is blindsided there, and that's obviously pretty bad. And she is the main target coming to the following round, especially after Keith wins final 5 immunity there. and would have been taken out had it not been for Natalie playing her idol on her, which is obviously a pretty hairy situation. The fact that she needed someone else to play an idol on her to get through that round is pretty bad. And it's not even in a spot to where she stayed by Natalie due to her relationship with Natalie. It's more so because it was the optimal move for Natalie to make to begin with, where she had to break up Baylor and Missy as the last pair in the game, to where had she not done so, then they would have had a pair coming into the final four, and if Keith won immunity, then Natalie would have been in danger there. But I feel like the fact that Jacqueline was in that position is obviously pretty lucky. And by the end, she really couldn't win the game to where she would have lost to both Natalie and Keith. And the only votes she was ever going to get were from John and Reed, which I guess kind of says something there. But I feel like Jacqueline is someone who obviously spends a decent amount of the middle game in a pretty powerful position working with John, but that was also in a spot to where John was her loved one, and I feel like she was pretty fortunate to have John in the game as an extra number, where I feel like I was more impressed by other people in this grouping at the point where they were in pretty good positions, and mixing that in with the fact that it wasn't just her end game that was rough, it was also her pre-swap, where she was in a pretty bad position. I feel like those factors were enough to have her at the bottom of this grouping to where she's here at number 56. Now moving on to number 55, and we have yet another person who fits into this grouping, and here we have Deshawn from Survivor 41. And Deshawn was another person who was pretty hard to assess here, as he's another one of these players who was in a pretty powerful position for a decent chunk of the game, but just completely lost control at the points where he wasn't in that dominant position. Where early on, he's in a pretty good spot on the original Luvu tribe, where it did seem like he was going to be the swing vote had they ever gone the tribal there, having pretty good connections with the Erica and Heather side, but also with the Danny and Nasir side of things. Now, granted, I don't love that he tried to throw the immunity challenge to put himself in that position, but he still was in a pretty good spot, would have been safe had they ever gone the tribal there. And carrying over to the merge, he's also in a pretty good spot, being part of the majority alliance that's able to pick off a lot of the old Yase's one by one. And he's even part of the sham blindside that happened at the final 8, flipping against the leader of that majority alliance that he was a part of. And again, I feel like his game up until the final 8 is pretty good for the most part. However, I do feel like from the final 7 on, his game completely crumbles, where at the final 7, he loses control, where he, Danny, and Liana are on the bottom and are slowly picked off one by one. Now, granted, at the final 7, he is part of the do or die twist there, and on some level, you can argue that this is unlucky of Deshawn, the fact that he is part of this really bad twist that could have screwed him over. However, I actually think it kind of helps him out, as through him surviving do or die, he's given immunity there in a spot to where he probably would have been voted out had he not been given immunity there, but instead, Liana goes out instead. At the final 6, you have the vote basically splitting on Danny and Deshawn there, and you have him trying to blow up Erica's spot with his truth bomb, but that kind of backfires, and he kind of gets lucky that Danny is seen as a bigger threat there. Final 5, he does vote out Ricard, but he probably would have been the boot instead had Ricard won immunity. And then final 4, he has to go into fire making, where he really doesn't have much of a shot of winning a final tribal by that point, and he just blatantly loses at the end, only getting Danny's vote. So in a lot of ways, I find Deshawn's game really hard to assess, where on some level, he is a pretty powerful player for a lot of the game, really for the first 2/3 of the game, but I feel like the back third of his game is really rough, where he's just barely surviving, where at the final 7, he would have been voted out had he not been given immunity there. Final 6 and final 5, there were simply bigger targets in the likes of Danny and Ricard, and he would have been the backup target had they won immunity there. And then he just doesn't win at the end. So while a lot of his game is relatively smooth, I feel like the back third is so bad that it kind of drags him back down to this grouping here, to where he's here number 55. Now moving on to number 54, and we have yet another player who has a pretty bad stretch of their game, but also a decent stretch of their game. And here we have Dean from Survivor Island of the Idols. And I feel like for Dean, it's his pre-merge that's pretty bad, where I feel like he gets out to a pretty rough start, but is able to turn it around by the post-merge section of the game, where early on, like I said, he is towards the bottom of the original Lyro tribe, where while he does vote out Ronnie at the first tribal, he's later on the outs during the Vince vote, that's not great. He's later blindsided at the Chelsea Walker blindside, that's also not great, and he's just kind of barely surviving that. He also gets a pretty bad swath to where he's once again towards the bottom on the outs when Tom Blaylock goes home, and he ends up being the primary target at the following tribal, where the majority of the tribe plans to vote him out there, only for him to be saved by Kelly using an idol on him, which in itself is kind of wonky, as while I could say that it's due to him having a good bond with Kelly, I think a lot of it's also due to, one, the fact that they had a mutual connection from outside the game, so through that they already felt pretty good about each other, but I think even more important, the fact that Kelly just wanted to move for her resume, to where I can't really give Dean that much credit for saving himself in this situation. And regardless, the fact that he had an idol played on him is a pretty big knock against him regardless. But I do feel like after the merge, his game does turn up a bit, where he's able to integrate himself within Tommy's power structure and build a really strong bond with him to the point where they build the Final Three along with Dan Spilo, and they essentially run a lot of the post merge, being able to pick off a lot of the old rivals one by one. Now, obviously, you have the Final Eight where he did have this opportunity to flip the game against Tommy, only for him to leak the plan to Tommy at Tribal and cause that entire plan to go downhill. And while he could knock Dean for not pulling the trigger in that spot, I actually don't disagree with Dean sticking by Tommy in this spot, considering how well positioned he was with him. And I feel like there would just been more opportunities to flip on Tommy later. So I actually don't fault Dean that much for the Final Eight, but regardless, he never really gets the opportunity to flip on Tommy regardless, which is a problem, and I feel like he would have needed to do that if he wanted any shot of winning at the end. I think he also gets kind of unlucky that Dan gets ejected from the game, which I already talked about with Nora. I do think it was the right decision by production, but I do think it also takes away someone that Dean could have beaten at the end. To where by the Final Five, I don't think Dean wins in really any Final Three combination there, which is obviously a problem as well. But I do think Dean is someone who, again, embodies this grouping of people who had a pretty bad stretch of the game, where in this case, it's pretty much the entire pre-merge for Dean, if we're being honest. But I think he's able to turn it around by the end. He's able to have a pretty smooth post-merge, all things considered, where he's probably the majority there, has a pretty clear path to the end as a result. And you can say that he tried to make certain moves at certain points, but I feel like the fact that his game is pretty inconsistent, and by the end he didn't really have much win equity, that leaves him behind at number 54. Now moving on to number 53, and we have another player who has a pretty good stretch of the game, but also a pretty rocky stretch, and here we have Angelina from Survivor David versus Goliath. And again, I feel like Angelina also fits in this grouping of these players who have a pretty rough stretch of the game, but also pretty good stuff there. Where early on, Angelina's in a pretty powerful position on the original Goliath group, where she's essentially in the center of the tribe and is part of the majority when Jeremy goes out. That's all pretty good. And even after the swap, she's also the majority, where the Goliaths have the numbers, but even then are able to pull in Nick along the way. And while she does stuff like asking for Natalie's jacket and getting into fights with Lyrsa that rubs them the wrong way with her, she's able to be part of the majority alliance that takes both of them out. But while Angelina's pre-merge is, for the most part, pretty strong, I do think her post-merge is where things get a lot less consistent, where right off the bat, you have her sort of being a scapegoat from the Goliath group, where she's kind of being thrown under the bus there. People aren't really listening to her. You have the entire Elizabeth situation where she tells her she's going home in order to get Elizabeth's jury vote. That's all pretty bad. You also have the John Hennigan round where the Goliaths just seem so willing to dump Angelina at that point, which is all pretty bad. The David split their votes onto her. You have her begging Dana Tribal to use his idol on her, and while he ultimately does so, I think that's another thing that harms her reputation moving forward. And while she later jumps ship to the David side after they get the numbers and votes out Alec at the final 10, she's later blindsided the final 9 after Gabby and Christian flip, and she's on the outs during that vote. And in general, I would say that this early merge is probably the rockiest section of her entire game, where there are multiple points where she's clearly towards the bottom and not being included on certain votes. And again, a lot of it's not particularly great. However, I do think from the final 8 on, she does finally find her footing in the game, where at that point she's able to align with Mike White and later pull in Nick into a final 3 deal. And they're essentially able to be in the majority for the rest of the game afterwards, taking out the old Davids one by one. And you even have her taking out Allison at the final 5 after trying to trick her into playing a fake idol, which is all pretty funny there. But I do also think Angelina does a lot to harm her perception, like around and across the pre-merge, you have incidents like the whole Natalie jacket situation. After the merge, you have her telling Elizabeth she's going home. You have her begging Dan to use her idol. There are just so many things she does that ultimately make it hard for her to win a jury vote at the end. And sure enough, she does end up being a 0 vote finalist by the end of it. But I still feel like there are multiple points in the game where Angelina is clearly in the majority, where I feel like she is in the majority for pretty much the entire pre-merge, and she's also in a pretty good spot for the entire end game. But it's just that middle stretch is pretty rocky for her, and by the end, she just couldn't win a jury vote, which is why she's here at number 53. Now moving on to number 52, and we have another person who I really didn't know what to do with. I considered having them below Angelina, but after thinking about it, I did think they had some moments of impressive gameplay, and that is Heidi from Survivor 44. And Heidi was another person who I just didn't really know what to do with. Where on some level you can argue that she doesn't have the same highs as some of the other players we already talked about, but I also think she doesn't have the same lows per se. even though I think a lot of her post-merge is pretty rocky as well, where early on she's in a pretty good spot in the original Soka tribe, where she's closely aligned with Danny, and she is clearly a major factor in the Claire vote that happens at the only tribal they attend before the merge. That's all pretty good. And then after the merge, she is once again in a pretty good spot within the Soka group. Though I think a major problem is that the Sokas end up being outplayed by the Tikas by the end of it. And I feel like Heidi doesn't really do much to counteract that. Where early on in the merge, they obviously lose Matt at the split tribal, which they didn't really have much to do with. And while Heidi did try to control Lauren's vote to change that, it just wasn't giving enough there. After that, they are successful in idling out Brandon, the leader of the Ratu side, but they also allow the Tikas to get away with voting with the Ratus in order to presumably play in the middle there. And the fact that they didn't clock the Tikas more for blatantly playing the middle in this fashion is a problem on really all the Soka's ends, but also Heidi's as well. We get to the next round where she does vote out Kane there, but also gets some votes from Lauren and Jamie. That's not particularly great. We get to the final 8 where she tries to make a move by blindsiding Danny, but is completely unsuccessful in gaining any traction from that, and even get some votes from Carolyn and Franny, which is all pretty bad. And what's even crazier is that the very next round, Danny is blindsided, this time by the Tikas, and Heidi doesn't even vote out Danny in that spot, where she instead tries to blindside Carson, only for her vote to be negated by an idol. So the fact that she tried to make this Danny move at the final 8, only to not even vote out Danny when Danny actually goes home, is pretty bad there. And she eventually gets to a pretty bad endgame where she allows the Tikas to get all the way to the final 4 intact, and at the same time failing to build these good relationships with Jamie and Lauren, these two outsiders that she should be working with to take out the Tikas, where instead Jamie and Lauren are targeting Heidi in multiple opportunities. So the fact that Heidi is never able to mend those bridges with them in order to counteract the Tikas is also a pretty massive nod to her game there. Now she does make a somewhat impressive move at the final 4 where she wins immunity but gives it up to take on Carson and Firemaking, which I do give her a little bit of credit for, as that's something not many other players would do, as we've only seen it happen one other time in the era of forced Firemaking, but it's not enough to gain her the respect of the jury, where she only gets one jury vote by the end of it. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Heidi also fits into this grouping of players where she has a pretty strong pre-merge, and even after the merge, I feel like she's in a somewhat interesting position on the Soka group, though I think a massive failing of her is her inability to really counter the Tikas, to really allow them to get so deep into the game together without really making much of an effort to combat them. And even at the end, even after it's clear that the Tikas are in a pretty powerful position, still not being able to put the pieces together and working with Jamie and Lauren to take them out. But I still have to give her a little bit of credit for putting herself in the fire. I think that's at least something to credit her with, and a reason why she's above Angelina. But really beyond that, I feel like she fits pretty perfectly into this grouping, which is why she's here number 52. Now moving on to number 51, and we're finally moving on to another grouping of players, as these are now players who were in the majority for most of their runs. They don't really have that big of town turns, and while they didn't have much agency in the game, they at least had some impressive elements in their game that leads them above some of the people we already talked about earlier. But number 51, we actually have someone from the most recent season of the show, and here we have Sue from Survivor 47. And Sue was obviously pretty hard to assess. I wasn't really sure what to make of her game, as obviously the perception of her is that she didn't really play the game for a lot of it. She's someone who was just pretty content to ride with Gabe and Caroline all the way to the end and didn't really do that much on her own. And while I would mostly agree with that, I do think there are a couple moments in the game where she had some influence in how the game played out, where right off the bat, she's in the majority alliance on the Tuku tribe, where she's part of this alliance with Gabe and Caroline. And while she's a target at the first tribal, where TK's Guys Alliance wants to target her there, she's able to have some influence in getting TK out there. Now, mind you, I think a lot of that is due to personal reasons as opposed to game reasons, where a lot of it felt like Sue just didn't like TK right off the bat. And obviously the fact that she wasn't playing the game that strategically is a big reason why she isn't higher on this list. But I still have to give her at least some credit for getting the target onto TK, and also for getting Tiana on their side, to where supposedly Tiana and Sue had a pretty good relationship on the island, which obviously played a factor there. And moving forward, she's able to remain the majority for a lot of the game, for the rest of the pre-merge pretty much, and even in the merge, she's able to hold control again. Now she does vote out Tiana at the split tribal, which is obviously pretty unfortunate, but afterwards, the Tukus are able to hold strong for the next few rounds. However, it's around the final 9 where things obviously go wrong for her, where she's blindsided the Gabe round, being the only person to not vote out Gabe there, which is obviously pretty bad. However, she's later able to get out Kyle the next round, where she had been pushing for Kyle for a while, but even then, I think a lot of that was more so due to Kyle being a big threat at the end of the day. Now, she is blindsided again at the final 7, losing Caroline, her other ally there, in a spot to where she would have gone to the end with Caroline had she been given the opportunity, which is obviously a problem as she loses to Caroline. However, I do think the final 6 she's able to recover somewhat, where she's able to align with Rachel, who through Rachel having the idol is able to be on the in for that vote. And Sue's also a major factor in getting the target onto Andy over Sam, where Sam was going to be the target for a lot of that round, but Sue was able to get the target onto Andy. Now, again, I think some of that's due to emotional reasons, where she just didn't want Andy to get further into the game, but I do have to give Sue at least some credit for getting the target to Andy in that situation. And again, she's essentially working with Rachel the rest of the game, where granted she doesn't win at the end against really anyone, but I feel like the fact that Sue was at least in the majority for most of her run and had some minor impressive elements in her game was a big reason why she was above some of the other people we already talked about. These people who were in the majority for most of the runs, but didn't have much agency within that. I feel like Sue is someone who at least had a couple glimmers of influence in the game, even though I don't think it was really that much at the end of the day, but it was enough to have her here at number 51. Now moving on to number 50, and we have another person who didn't have that much influence in the game, but had at least one impressive moment to them, and that is Laurel from Survivor Ghost Island. And Laurel's another person who was technically in the majority lines for most of the game, and through that gave them a lot of safety and a pretty clear path towards the end. However, they didn't really have a lot of agency within that. Now, I think early on in her original Malolo group, she's not really in the best spot there, to where, while she does vote out Gonzalez at the first tribal, Jacob Derwin at the second tribal, I feel like she's not really in the core of that. We think it's a swap where I think she makes probably her best move this season in blindsiding Morgan, where her and the other Malolos are able to take advantage of the division within the Navidi contingent there to blindside Morgan there. That's all pretty good. And moving forward, I feel like she's in a pretty good spot afterwards, where her and Donathan align with Wendell and Dominic, and through that, they're able to essentially be in the majority for the rest of the season afterwards. And that carries over into the merge as well, where that group ends up running the table for a lot of it. Now, I think a key problem for Laurel is that she never really flips against Wendell and Dominic, which is obviously a problem in the sense that she needed to get one of them out in order to actually win the game. But at the same time, she also would have been in a lot of danger had she actually pulled the trigger there. And while she had opportunity to do so, like at the final 8, I feel like it just didn't make that much sense for her to do so, sort of similar to what I mentioned with Dean from IOI there in terms of flipping against Tommy. But I do think Laurel does eventually arrive at an endgame where she really can't win the game by the end of it, and sure enough, she eventually does get 0 votes due to her getting to the end with Dominic and Wendell there. But I still think Laurel is someone who definitely had one key highlight, in that being the Morgan blindside, and beyond that is in the majority for the rest of the game, but is clearly the third within this dominant alliance. And despite her having opportunities to flip the game, she technically doesn't take them at the end of the day, which is a big reason why she's here number 50. Now moving on to number 49, we have another person in this grouping, and actually this person has a bigger knock to their game than the people we just talked about, but I feel like they were more solidly in the majority for more of the game. And here we have Cassidy from Survivor 43. And Cassidy was another pretty interesting player here, someone who was technically in the majority for most of their run, and was pretty well positioned within that, to where she was clearly aligned with James and Carla for a lot of it. The only thing, a problem here is she is being targeted by the minority, where Gio and Ryan are targeting her for a lot of that pre-merge, and while I do have to give her some credit for getting Carla to side with her over them, I still think it's a problem that she was being targeted from relatively early on there. And after the merge, she is once again by the majority, taking out Ellie, taking out Dwight, taking out Janine. But then we get to the split tribal, which I do think is probably the rockiest point of her game here, where she is one of the main options on the board between her and Ryan. And I think she plays pretty poorly across that round. I don't think she does that much to really make her case. And she largely gets saved due to the fact that they went second and they got to see that James had been voted out at the other split tribal, where Jesse and Cody had talked about afterwards how if it was a non-Coco that had been voted out at that split tribal, in this case Owen, that they would have pulled the trigger and taken out Cassidy there. So I do think Cassidy gets really lucky that they got to see what happened at the other split tribal, and that was largely what saved her here. But I think after that, she is once again part of the majority and really is able to stay in that position for the rest of the game, where she builds a final 3 deal with Owen and Gabler. They're able to essentially run the table, working with Jesse from that point on. She eventually flips against Carla, and obviously while she ends up burning Carla along the way, to where Carla blackmailed her with her jury vote, I still think that was the right move for her to make at that point. And she eventually is able to have a pretty clean ride to the end against Owen and Gabler, but obviously ends up losing to Gabler here. And I do think that's another issue. The fact that she ends up losing in probably her best case scenario makes you wonder how much win equity she truly had across a lot of the season. And in general, I find Cassidy's game kind of hard to assess, where I feel like she was in the majority for most of her run, but I do think there were a couple of points where she was being targeted, particularly in the pre-merge, and obviously that split tribal is just really wonky for her, where she's essentially saved by stuff that happened outside of her control there, so I wasn't really sure what to do with her, so because of that, she's here number 49. Now moving on to number 48, and we have another person that fits pretty cleanly into this tier, and here we have Sherry from Survivor Karamoan. And I actually consider having Sherry in the previous section of players who had one part of their game that was much better than the others, as I do think that largely applies to Sherry here, where I feel like her pre-swap was pretty strong, where she was in a pretty central position on the original fans group, where she's a key figure in getting out Allie and Hope. She obviously had Shamar as a clear ally until Shamar got medevac there. And I feel like Sherry's beginning of her game is pretty strong, but I think she takes her foot off the gas as the game goes along, where at the merge, she is the secondary target there, but they had the majority there. And from that point on, she is in the majority of the rest of the game, never really being on the outs from that point on, but she really just gives up control to the likes of Dawn and Cochran. I feel like she doesn't really do much in herself. And again, I feel like her post-merge is much weaker than her pre-merge here, and that's why I did consider having her in that previous group. But the reason why I decided to have her above them is that I feel like her weak section of the game is still one where she's in the majority per se. She's not really being on the outs of many votes. It's just that she's just not doing nearly as much as what she did in her pre-swap section. So I feel like for those reasons, I did decide that Sherry was one step above these other players, and she is technically in the majority for the entire game. However, I feel like her pre-merge is pretty strong, her post-merge is pretty passive, to where she's here at number 48. Now moving on to number 47, and we have another person who fits pretty cleanly into this tier in my eyes, and we're actually going back to the new era, and here we have Carolyn from Survivor 44. And Carolyn was another pretty interesting player here, someone who was obviously part of this notable group in the Tika 3 that ends up running a lot of the game. I feel like Carolyn was by far the least involved in what that group was doing, where I feel like Carson and Jan were doing more of the legwork, they had more of the connections, and they had more influence in how they were able to navigate through a lot of the game, where I feel like Carolyn was just the third for a lot of that. Now, if we are looking at her pre-merge, she is initially in an interesting spot there where, while she's being targeted by Sarah and Helen, she does have the majority to save her, in the likes of Jan, they're able to pull in Carson there, and they're able to get through that round all right. She does get a pretty interesting swap afterwards where Josh ends up joining their group, and we see Josh approaching Carolyn to flip the game against Sarah, start using her as a swing vote there, and I do think Carolyn makes the right decision there, going against Jan and voting at Sarah, which should have made her the swing vote had they ever gone back to tribal, though I do think Jam does counteract her, where we do see Jam being able to repair things with her, we do see him repairing things with Josh, and it did seem like Jan was going to be in the middle of that vote regardless, and while he was clearly going to side with Carolyn there, I do think she didn't really have as much agency coming out of that round as I would have expected, but they avoid tribal, so whatever. And then once the merge hits, we see them reunite with Carson. From that point on, she is in the majority of the rest of the game, but as I alluded to earlier, I think Carson and Jan were way more involved in how they were able to navigate the middle during a lot of that section, going between the Ratu and Soka sides, whereas I feel like Carolyn was the least effective of those three, where we get to the Brandon round, where you have this plan where Carson and Jan are going to vote with the Ratus there to make it seem like they're playing the middle, but Carolyn's not part of that. She votes for Brandon there. So I feel like she doesn't really get as much credit for that move there. You have the final 8 where Carson and Jan blindside Franny, who was one of her closest allies there, and blindsiding Carolyn in the process, taking away one of her options as well, which is all not pretty good. Now, she does have a somewhat impressive move at the final 7 where she does use her idol on Carson there. And while Danny had the votes to go home anyway, I do think it's a minor thing you can point out there. But then you have the final 6 where she is the minority target from Jamie and Lauren, but gets through that. And in general, I feel like Carolyn is the least effective of the Tikas, where while they are able to run the table for a lot of the season, I feel like Carson and Jim are way more involved and are actively getting their way on more opportunities than Carolyn is. Where I feel like the final 8 is probably the biggest example of that, where Carolyn was closer to Franny than Carson and Jan were, but yet Carson and Jan decided to blindside Franny and taking away that option from her, to where had she been able to keep Franny in the game, that could have been an option for her moving forward to potentially position herself better in the end game. So at the end of the day, I feel like Carolyn was a pretty hard player to assess. And while there were some minor moments where she had some agency here and there, I feel like it's not really enough to have her too much higher, even though she was technically the majority for most of the season, which is why she's here at number 47. Now moving on to number 46, and we have a player who's kind of similar to Carolyn in a few ways, as we'll be talking about in a moment, but we actually have Katie from Survivor Palau, and I think Katie is another pretty interesting player here, where on paper you would assume that she's just someone who was there for the ride, where she was part of the core group, the group that was able to dominate a lot of the challenges in the pre-merge, and while she was part of the majority group after the merge, was not really effective in getting her way at many points, and was simply dragged to the end by Tom and Ian. However, I do think Katie was at least trying to position herself better and was trying to make these moves against Tom and Ian, but was simply unsuccessful in getting those plans to go through. Now, like I said, a lot of her pre-merge is kind of whatever, where they're just winning a lot of challenges, not much is really happening. Now, you do have Willard voting for her at the one travel they go to in the pre-merge, but Willard was such an easy target anyway that it doesn't really matter that much. And then after the merge hit, she is part of the majority group again, where she takes out Kobe at that first tribal, and was part of the majority that would have taken out Stephanie until Janu quit the game. But then we get to the final 7, where she is pulled into this women's alliance that could have flipped the game against Tom until Karen decided to lead the plan because Karen sucks, and through that she has to vote out Stephanie there. But then we get to the final 6, where she is a swing vote there between the Tom and Ian side and the Greg and Jen side. And I feel like that could have put Katie in a pretty interesting spot moving forward until Karen decides to stick with the Tom and Ian side. And through that, she kind of has to side with Tom and Ian in order to avoid Rock. So that is pretty unfortunate there. And from that point on, she is part of this movement to try to get Tom out of the game, but is unsuccessful in doing so due to Tom winning immunities. And she's eventually just dragged to the end to where she loses to both Tom and Ian, which is obviously pretty unfortunate there. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Katie's game is kind of similar to Carolyn's, where I feel like Carolyn is someone who definitely had opportunities where she could have taken more control of the game, only for other people to override that. And I feel like Katie's kind of in a similar boat, where she had these opportunities to flip the game against Tom, but was unable to do so because, one, Karen was pretty loyal to Tom, but also Tom just won out at the end. So I feel like for those reasons, I can't have Katie too much higher than here, but I feel like the fact that Katie was at least trying to upend the power structure rather than just give herself more options moving forward was enough to have her one spot higher than Carolyn, which is why she's here at number 46. Now moving on to number 45, and we have another person who was in the majority for most of the run, didn't really have much to do with the strategy of that group, but was at least relatively safe for a lot of the game, and here we have Danielle from Survivor Panama. And I feel like Danielle is sort of similar to these other players, these players that was part of a dominant alliance in the game, but didn't really have much to do with the strategy of that group. Where early on, she's part of the majority on the Kasaya tribe, and while that wasn't the most stable alliance in the world, they are able to hold strong, voting out Melinda and Bobby at the two tribals they go to. After the merge, they have the numbers, and are able to begong the old Laminas one by one until Terry is left. And again, I feel like Danielle isn't really that active in the game, it's just part of the ride there. Though we do get to the final 6 where she is part of this pretty impressive move where she is working with Suri and Aris, and they're able to pull off this 3-2-1 vote to blindside Courtney in order to give them a clear path to the end there. Though at the same time, I don't think she was the most well positioned within the Aris and Suri group, to where I feel like Aris and Suri were going to take each other to the end. I feel like Danielle would have been on the outs there had they gotten to the final 3 together, and kind of gets lucky that Terry is still there, where Terry wins immunity again at final 5, allowing them to vote out Shane. And the final 4, while Terry does not win immunity there, he has an idol that essentially gives him immunity in that round that basically gives Danielle the opportunity to break up Aris and Suri at that point. To where had they gotten out Terry at some point before the final 4, then I feel like Danielle would have been in a pretty bad spot going into the final 3. But through that, she's able to beat Suri in firemaking and get to a final 3 where she's essentially guaranteed final 2 where both Terry and Aris were going to take her, though obviously she loses to both of them. So at the end of the day, I do question whether her involvement in the 3-2-1 was the right move for her in particular, as I feel like while it does give her a clearer path to the end game, it also makes it more difficult for her to actually win the game, as I feel like she probably does win against Courtney had she gotten to the end with her, though obviously she does vote out Courtney at the final 6. So at the end of the day, I feel like Danielle is probably not the most set up to get to the end or win the game, but the fact that she was at least in the majority for essentially the entire game and obviously had this person to take out in Terry, this easy target, was enough to have her at least this high on the list, but I can't really have her any higher than number 45. Now moving on to number 44, and we're moving on to a player who was debatably in more danger in the pre-merge, but I feel like had a much smoother ride to the end compared to Danielle, and that person is Ben from Survivor 46. And Ben was another pretty interesting player here, someone who I feel like fits pretty well into this grouping of players, where I feel like he doesn't have that much agency across a lot of the game, but is in a very strong position to get through a lot of the game. Now, early on, he's kind of in a not great position on the original Sega group where they're being targeted by the gems of the world. And we even see Ben becoming the target at the one tribal they go to, where a lot of people assume that Tim has the Beware advantage that causes the target to shift onto Ben there, which is obviously a pretty precarious spot. However, I give Ben a lot of credit for building a bond with Charlie to the point where Charlie decides to side with Tim and Ben over the Gem and Mariah side. So I did give Ben quite a bit of credit for getting Charlie and Maria on board with them when they had other options there. So I think that's all pretty good. Now after the merge, they do face a bit of adversity where obviously the Seagulls are being targeted initially. They do lose Mariah at that mergatory round and then lose Tim at the other tribal where Ben's on the outs there. But I feel like from the split tribal on, Ben is pretty safe in the game where he and Charlie are able to be in a pretty powerful position there, taking out a lot of the big threats one by one. And something I do have to give Ben a lot of credit for is that he did have Charlie's true loyalty to where Charlie and Ben had this pretty clear Final 3 deal and were in a pretty primed position to get to the end together. Now, at the same time, I think win equity is definitely an issue with Ben to where I don't think Ben wins in many Final 3 scenarios. It seems like a lot of jury seemed to like Ben on a personal level, but didn't seem to have the respect there. But the fact that Ben was able to build such a strong relationship with Charlie, who did dominate the game, to where Charlie decided to take them to the end is somewhat impressive in my eyes. And I feel like the fact that Ben actively saved himself at that gem tribal is all pretty good at the end of the day. And also the fact that he was in the majority for almost the entire game is all pretty good in my eyes. And a reason why he is this high on the list. But again, the fact that he didn't have much win equity, the fact that he doesn't really have much of a signature move beyond saving himself at certain points was enough to leave him behind at number 44. Now moving on to number 43, and we're rounding out this grouping with a few players who I do feel like had win equity by the end of it. Definitely came somewhat close to winning, but kind of squandered it by the end. By number 43, we're going back to an old school season, and here we have Clay Jordan from Survivor Thailand. And Clay is someone who was not very active for a lot of the season, where while he was part of the Chewy-Gon alliance that dominates a lot of the game, I feel like Clay is someone who didn't really have much agency within that, where I feel like Brian was way more involved in the actual decision making there. And I think for a lot of the season, he's just there for the ride. Now, it's not entirely smooth sailing to where he does get a vote against him during the John Raymond round. He also gets some votes against him during the Gandia round, which I think kind of says something there. But he is voting the majority the entire time. And then after the merge, we do see the Chewy-Gon scan the numbers, and they're able to bagong the old Sukjais one by one. And for the most part, I don't think Clay is that involved in the actual decision making there. I do think Brian is more involved in deciding who goes during a lot of these rounds. And then once it's down to the Chewy-Gons, you have Brian siding with Clay simply due to Clay being seen as a GOAT. And we do see them picking off Ted at the final 5, Helen at the final 4, and then cutting Jan at final 3. And obviously Brian drags Clay through a lot of the game. But despite this, Clay only loses in a 4-3 jury vote, where despite Clay being dragged as a GOAT, he was actually able to build decent bonds with the Sukjais on the jury there that allows him to get to that 4-3 vote, where on the other hand, you have Brian not even remembering Sheehan's name and not even knowing anything about Penny. So I feel like I had to give Clay at least some credit for that. And in terms of the final vote, I do think he could have gotten it from people like Helen, for instance, who was very upset by Brian during Final Tribal. And while Ted was kind of a lost cause, I do think Clay was actually somewhat close to winning despite him being seen as his GOAT. So I feel like that alone is a major reason why he is towards the top of this grouping. But at the end of the day, I feel like he doesn't have too much agency outside of bonding with the Sukjais, which considering he was up against Brian was a pretty low bar to clear, but it wasn't enough to have him this high in the list to where he's here at number 43. Now moving on to number 42, when we have another player who came pretty close to winning, even though they didn't have the most agency in the world. And here we have Nalia from Survivor Marquesas. And in a lot of ways, I feel like Nalia also fits into this grouping where, admittedly, for a lot of the game, she's not really playing that hard, where while she's in the majority during the pre-merge, voting out Sarah Jones at the first tribal they go to and Gina at the second tribal, and also having this really tight bond with Pascal, I feel like beyond that, Nalia herself doesn't really play that hard. She even admits that she didn't start playing the game until day 24, which I think is a massive issue there. But I do feel like she at least gets some credit for flipping the game. We're at the final 9. She is not part of the road to 4 there, but is part of the flip that happens that flips the game with them, taking out John Carroll at the final 9 and picking off the other people along the way. And I feel like Nalia deserves some credit for that. Now, I will probably give more credit to people like Kathy, for instance, but I do feel like Nalia is at least part of the move, which I think is at least somewhat impressive. Now, I think her game kind of goes downhill at the final four, where you have Vizepia winning immunity, and she's able to build a final two deal with Kathy that essentially pits them against Nalia and Pascal and causes Nalia to be part of a 2-2 tie, which is obviously pretty bad. And then she later loses Pascal in the rock draw, which is by itself pretty dumb, but she's essentially put in a pretty bad spot coming into Final 3, where she has to win Final Immunity. Or at least it seemed that way at first until Kathy dropped out of Hands on a Heart Idol, to where at that point she's able to build a Final 2 deal with Vizepia, wins immunity herself, and she does eventually take Vizepia to the end, which I do think is the correct choice for Nalia, as I think she blatantly loses to Kathy there. And sort of similar to Clay, it ends up being a 4-3 jury vote, where Nalia comes pretty close to winning. And I actually think Nalia very realistically could have gotten one of the votes from the other road twos there, people like John, for instance. Though I think a major issue for Nalia is that she doesn't get that vote, where in general, I feel like Nalia has a pretty bad final trial performance where she doesn't really own her game that much. She kind of comes off as this young, naive girl. And considering that she was up against Vizepia, someone who also had a pretty bad final trial performance, the fact that Nalia couldn't get that other vote is a pretty big indictment to her game. And the fact that she couldn't get that last jury vote is a big issue for me. But I feel like the fact that Nalia still came pretty close to winning, despite her not really playing the game that hard, is a major reason why she is this high on the list. But I feel like the fact that she just squandered her chance of actually winning the game was a big reason why she is behind here, number 42. Now moving on to number 41, and we have the final person in this grouping, and here we have Mike Turner from Survivor 42. And Mike was a pretty interesting player to assess here as well. As while he's not necessarily a dominant player across a lot of the season, he's still one who's pretty well positioned and someone who I would say is the most active out of anyone in this grouping here. Now, that's not to say he played particularly well. However, he still had some win equity by the end of it. Where early on, he's seemingly in a good spot in the original Vati group. Now he is on the outs during the Jenny tribal, where he loses his closest ally there. However, I don't really knock him that much for that, considering that was just a really crazy tribal, and I don't feel like Mike did that much wrong to cause Jenny to go out there. I feel like it was more so the mistakes of other people. But after he loses Jenny, he's able to regroup, he's able to align with Hai and Lydia, and is eventually able to take out Daniel Strunk at the last tribal before the merge. And then after the merge, his bonds with Hai and Lydia allow him to be included in the new majority alliance that forms there, where unlike Romeo, whose bond with Drea was not enough to be included within that, Mike was actually able to be included in the majority alliance, and is able to remain in a pretty good spot for a lot of the game afterwards. Though at the same time, I think it's after the merge that we start to see more of his flaws, where first up he does vote out Lydia, which I do think weakens the Vati continuum within the majority alliance, where I feel like it gives more control to the Takus moving forward. He later votes out Chanel in a spot to where Chanel is pretty angry at him and is obviously going to be a vote against him on the jury. That's not great. He later votes out Roxroy in a spot to where he was lying to Roxroy by saying that he was his number one, but ends up voting him out anyway. That's not a great look. And then at the final 8, he votes out Hai in a spot to where Hai was pretty loyal to him and is kind of tricked by Homer into doing so. So I feel like he makes some pretty suboptimal moves despite him technically being somewhat active in the game. We think at the final 6, where he is technically part of the Omer blinds that happens there, but he was one of the most reluctant people to do that move and had to be talked into it, and even then split the vote into Romeo there. We get to the final 5, where he plays his idol on Marianne in a spot to where Marianne already had an idol, which just gave her further ammunition to use against him at final tribal. And then we get the final 4, where he fails to get at Marianne. He has to go into fire against Jonathan, and while he does beat Jonathan, it also takes away someone he could have beaten at the end as well. And he does ultimately lose in a 7-1 jury vote there. However, I think something interesting about Mike is very similar to Clay and Nalia. He actually had some respect from a jury, where despite him having some pretty questionable jury management during a lot of the post-merge, he actually came into final trouble with 3 jury votes, it seemed like, to where had that stuck, it would have been a pretty close jury vote there. Now he does ultimately squander it and has a pretty bad final trial performance, very similar to Nalia, though at least he was going up against Marianne, who actually had a pretty strong final trial performance to where those votes probably go towards her anyway. But I still feel like Mike is someone who probably had the most agency out of anyone in this grouping here, while still having a shot to win, to where he had 3 votes coming into final trial against Marianne, and I think he would have won had he actually gotten Marianne out at final 4, where he beats Romeo and Jonathan. But I feel like beyond that, I feel like he still doesn't have the most agency in the world and kind of fits more into this grouping compared to the groupings we'll be talking about soon, which is why he's still here at number 41. Now moving on to number 40, and we're moving on to a different grouping of players here, as these are players who definitely were more active across certain points of the season compared to the previous groups, but also had some pretty big holes as well, such as lack of win equity or maybe one mistake that caused him to be on the outs for certain points. But number 40, we probably had the person who had the least amount of control out of this grouping, but also some interesting moments here and there. And here we have Dreams from Survivor Fiji. And Dreams was a very interesting player, definitely one of the more notable figures from the season, but also someone who I don't think wins the game in many scenarios, as it didn't seem like the jury really respected him all that much. And also someone who was definitely on the outs for certain points on their season, where early on he is towards the bottom of the original Moto group along with Cassandra, and while he does vote out Liliana at the one tribal they go to before the swap, he's really towards the bottom of that tribe. But it's around the swap that his game gets a lot more interesting, where at the swap he's able to align with Edgardo, Mookie, and Alex to form the Four Horsemen, and they're really able to take control for the rest of the pre-merge, taking out Anthony, taking out Rocky, taking out Lisi, and then you have the swap that happens right before the merge where they have the numbers there and they take out Michelle Yee. Though I think a problem here is Dreams is still at the bottom of the Four Horsemen, and we see that play out where he's the last one to learn about their idol. And while he eventually flips to the Earl side after the merge, telling them about the idol, encouraging them to vote out Edgardo there, he does so in a way that completely burns the Four Horsemen to where they're very unlikely to vote for him in a jury vote moving forward. And moving forward, Dreams does eventually take out the remaining horsemen there, sticking by Earl as well. Though it's around the final six that things get complicated once again, where you have the car deal with Yao Man, which is obviously not ideal, but he also recognizes that he can flip on Yao Man before the final four to ensure he doesn't have to go back on the deal. And we do see that play out where he is able to get most of the votes onto Yao Man there. However, it fails after Yao Man plays his idol. And he also fails again at the final five after Yao Man wins immunity, which sets him up for failure at the final four where he wins immunity and he has to very publicly back out of the deal, which is obviously the correct move as he should not be giving up immunity there, but it's obviously a pretty bad look for him to back out of his promise and voting out Yao Man in the process. And sure enough, he pretty much has no chance of winning by the end of it. And to be fair, he probably would have lost a jury vote even if he didn't have to back out of the deal, but I still think Dreams is a pretty interesting player, someone who definitely played a pretty active game where we saw him being able to align with the Four Horsemen before the merge, only to flip on them later on. And then you also have him trying to flip on Yao Man after making the car deal with him. But it's just the fact that he just couldn't win the game at the end, and he also had points where he was towards the bottom for a lot of it that makes it hard to have him above here. But it's just the fact that he was just so active in the game that leaves him relatively high here at number 40. Now moving on to number 39, and this is another player who was somewhat active in the game and was in the majority for a decent chunk of the game, but also made some questionable decisions and couldn't really win at the end. And we actually have Michael Skupin from Survivor Philippines. And I think Skupin is another player who fits pretty well into this grouping here, where he was in the majority for a decent chunk of his run, but did things that warranted his loss at the end, where early on he is initially part of the majority on the Tandang group. However, that later flips after Lisa, Artis, Abby, and Pete decide to form their own alliance, and in doing so, he's kind of towards the bottom along with RC. However, they are able to avoid tribal there due to them winning immunities. And then after the merge, while they are in the majority for the next few votes, where first they split the votes onto Penner and RC, and then later blindside Jeff Kent, I wouldn't say Skupin's really in that great of a spot there either. It's not until the final 9 that he and Lisa really take control of the game, where at that point they pull in Malcolm and Denise and blindside Artis. And really from the final 9 on, I do think Skupin has a lot of control in the game, where they are able to pick off the remaining Calabals one by one. And while they fail at securing a final 4 deal with Penner that essentially forces them to vote out Penner at final 7, I feel like Skupin and Lisa have a very smooth ride during a lot of that post-merge. Now, at the same time, I do think Skupin makes some pretty questionable decisions here, where at the final 5, you have Lisa approaching them to make a final 3 deal with Abby Maria, which would have been Skupin's ideal final 3 at that point. However, Skupin simply turns that down because he thinks it doesn't matter who he gets to the end with, which is obviously a failing on him. And he eventually gets to a final 3 with Lisa and Denise, to where he thinks that he has the game won, but is simply wrong. So I do think that's another major aspect to Scoopin, the fact that he couldn't really win the game at the end. He was kind of seen as a joke, but despite that, he still thought he could win. So I do think Scoopin wasn't the most aware about his actual game, and I do have to fault him quite a bit for turning down the final three deal with Ab Maria, which I think would have been his best case scenario, even though I don't think he wins that. I think Lisa wins that, but I still think Scoopin is a pretty tough player to assess, where I do think he has a lot of control in the game, particularly from the artist vote on, but I do think it's his lack of awareness, the fact that he didn't really have the most amount of control before that, and also just a complete lack of win equity at the end leaves him behind here at number 39. Now moving on to number 38, and we have another person who is pretty similar to Dreams and Scoopin in the sense that they couldn't really win the game, but was still pretty active throughout. And here we have Sugar from Survivor Gabon. And Sugar's another person that fits pretty well into this tier and is actually part of the majority for pretty much the entire game, outside the fact that they simply couldn't win by the end. Where again, on the original codas, they are pretty safe there. They vote up Paloma, not too much to say there. After the swap, they're able to integrate pretty well by building pretty good bonds with Ace and Maddie that keeps them pretty safe there, and they're a pretty big swing vote during the Ace tribal where they end up flipping against Ace, which in itself is a pretty questionable move, but they do have a lot of control at that point. And after the merge, he's able to be part of the new majority there, being part of that new Fong majority group, and they're able to pick off the pieces of the Onion Alliance until it's just Bob. And again, I feel like she has a pretty smooth ride to the end where she's never really in danger at any point. Mind you, I think a lot of that's also because she couldn't win the game, and through that people knew that they could drag her, but she's still a pretty influential force in that end game. And we see that the final four, where the plan was to vote out Bob after Susie won immunity there, only for Sugar to flip to keep Bob and force fire making challenge, which is obviously a questionable move as it does end up burning Maddie, who he thought was loyal to her, but it doesn't really matter as she loses against Maddie anyway. So in a lot of ways, I think Sugar's game is hard to assess, as on one hand, she is in the majority for the entire game. She is a key swing vote at several tribals across the season, and is someone who is relatively active across a lot of the season, but is also someone that just couldn't win the game at the end as no one really liked her that much. So for those reasons, I couldn't really have her any higher than number 38. Now moving on to number 37, and we have another player who's kind of in a similar ballpark where while they were in the majority for most of their season, they didn't really have that much win equity by the end of it. And that person is Monica Culpepper from Survivor Blood vs. Water. And Monica's in a similar boat. She's someone who was pretty much in the majority for the entire season, where she's in a pretty good spot in the original Galong tribe and votes on Laura Moret at the one tribal they attend before the swap. And she's also part of the majority after the swap, to where she's aligned with Tina, Katie, and Vitas. They vote out Kate, they vote out Laura Bonham. And then after the merge, she ends up flipping against her old alliance to work with Tyson and Jervis, and they essentially run the table from that point on. However, I do think some problems with Monica is, for one, I think she kind of gives up a lot of control to Tyson and Jervis, to where I feel like they're way more involved in decision making there. I also think her flipping on Aris and Tina's really burns them to where they're unlikely to vote for her at the end. And in general, I feel like win equity was a massive problem for Monica here, to where it didn't seem like the jury wanted to reward her in many situations. And beyond that, you also have the final 6 round where she was being targeted by the other side, and it went to a 3-3 tie. It also went to rocks there. So I think that is also a pretty precarious spot, to where had they lost out in that rock draw, then she would have had a much tougher road to getting towards the end of the game, but it kind of works out for her there. And while I did consider having Monica a little bit higher, considering she is technically in the majority for the entire game, considering she was the swing vote during key points in the game, I feel like the fact that she kind of gives up control after the merge and also doesn't have much win equity were a big reason why I dropped her closer to the Sugars of the world, to where I did decide to have her here number 37. Now moving on to number 36, and I'm actually a bit surprised this person is as high as they are, considering I was kind of critical of their game at the time of the player ranking. However, after running through the list, I feel like it kind of fits. But number 36, we actually have the other runner-up from the most recent season at the time of recording, and that is Sam from Survivor 47. And I think the thing about Sam is, I feel like I always think about the downsides to Sam's game whenever I think about the fact that he was on the outs during the early merge section and was obviously not in a great spot towards the end of the game. However, I do feel like he was actually in a better position for more of the game than I gave him some credit for here, where early on he is in a very good spot on the original Gada tribe, where he is a major decision maker during both the John Lovett and the Annika rounds, with the Annika round in particular being very good for him. The fact that he's able to convince Sierra to side with him and Andy over the likes of Rachel and Annika there, considering that Sierra had connections to them, is all pretty good there. Though he does lose control after the merge, and I actually had to fault him a good amount for that, considering a lot of it seemed to be due to him like being so willing to use Andy as a split vote during the Rome round, just making it very clear to Andy that he is pretty disposable to Sam's game, which obviously causes Andy to flip, and he's really on the bottom after the split tribal, where we do see the votes splitting onto him and Sierra, where there were actually some people that wanted to target him over Sierra, with the likes of Teeny, for instance. However, he's largely kept around due to him being perceived as more of a shield compared to Sierra, and he's obviously not in a great spot during the Sol round, to where while he is looped into that plan, eventually he wasn't even supposed to be part of the plan, and even afterwards is not successful in causing a flip to happen. Though I think from the final 9 on, his game definitely gets a bit more interesting, where I feel like he does good work at starting to reintegrate within the majority, to where he's part of the plan to take out Gabe at the final 9, Kyle at the final 8, and then we also get to Operation Italy that happens at the final 7, which is all pretty good there. Mind you, I don't know how much credit to give Sam in particular for the move, as I feel like people like Andy and Genevieve were more involved than him, but he is part of the ride for that. And really that should have set him up well moving forward, to where it seemed like that group of 3 was going to get towards the end of the game together. However, it kind of falls apart due to Rachel having an idol that causes him to be in a pretty bad spot coming to final 5. And then obviously at final 4, he has to go in the fire at that point. So I am a bit conflicted over where to have Sam here, as on one hand, there are definitely multiple points in the post-merge where he is towards the bottom, and through that, you could argue that he should be lower than some of these people we already talked about. However, the reason that I have him higher is, one, I feel like he gets a bit more unlucky during the points where he's not in the numbers per se, but I think another thing is, I do think he has some win equity in the season, to where I feel like had he gotten to the end against someone other than Rachel, he's a very likely winner in my eyes, to where I feel like in a Teeny and Sue final 3, that Sam is very likely the winner here. So I feel like the fact that Sam at least had some win equity by the end of it is a major reason why I decided to have him at least this high on the list, even though you can definitely argue that he should be lower, like back towards where like the Deshans and the Deans are, but I feel like considering how active he was, and also considering the points in the game where he was on the outs, I did decide that this was an okay spot for him, even though you could definitely argue that there should be better, but I feel like 36 is as high as I can put him. Now moving on to number 35, and we actually have someone who reminded me a lot of Sam, and this is probably the player I compared Sam the most to, even though I feel like there are some differences to their games, and that person is Brad Culpepper from Survivor Game Changers. And I feel like there are definitely some similarities here between Brad and Sam, where for one, I feel like their pre-merges are pretty strong, where Brad is in a pretty good spot on his original tribe as well as his SWAT tribe, where he is successful in voting out Caleb at the first tribal. But I feel like one of his major highlights comes during the joint tribal that happens immediately afterwards, where I feel like he deserves the most amount of credit for getting the target onto Malcolm and getting Ty to use his idol in Sierra there, really controlling that tribal, which I feel like is all pretty good there. And even carrying over to the earlier merge, you have him being part of this massive Aussie blindside that happens at the final 12. And in general, I would say that the first half of Brad's game is pretty strong. However, I do think after the Aussie blindside, it becomes a bit more turbulent, where the group that had formed to blindside Aussie fractures almost immediately afterwards, and Brad is later blindsided when Debbie goes out. That's not a great look. And while he's part of a vote split that happens the following round to take out Zeke, he's blindsided again at the final 9, where Sierra goes out, one of his closest allies. And I think another thing to mention is he essentially wins out from the final 9, to where outside the final 8, he is immune for every single round from the final 9 on, with the final 8 round being one to where he was the minority target. And there are definitely some cases to be made that he would have been targeted at certain tribals had he not won those immunities, though at the same time, it's not as if he's simply winning out. I do think he also does some good work in aligning with Sarah and Troyzan, and through that they're able to become the majority alliance that essentially runs the end of the game. Or at the final 7, they get out Michaela without too much difficulty. At the final 6, they're definitely benefited by Advantage Skadden, where Suri goes out, someone who was outside their core power structure. And then they vote out Aubrey at final 5, Ty final 4, not too much to say there. And again, I feel like this definitely puts Brad above someone like Ozzy, for instance, to where I feel like Ozzy definitely needed to win out by the end to get towards the end, to where I feel like Brad is someone who was definitely able to build his own path beyond winning challenges. He was able to at least reintegrate into a new majority alliance after being blindsided during the Debbie and Sierra rounds. Though I think win equity is another question, to where, while there were jurors who were not happy with Sarah by the end, I don't think Brad was a very likely winner either. I think he definitely needed to be up against better competition if he wanted any shot of winning. So I think he kind of fits into this grouping of players who definitely had a lot of agency across certain points of the season, though also struggled with actually winning towards the end. But I feel like the fact that he was at least able to recover more effectively than Sam definitely puts him above Sam on this ranking, to where he's here number 35. Now moving on to number 34, and we have the final person in this grouping, and here we have Missy from Survivor San Juan del Sur. And Missy, I think, also fits into this grouping, where I feel like in a lot of ways she struggles to win the game, where it seemed like a lot of the jury just didn't really like her that much, but is also someone that had a lot of agency across a lot of the season and was definitely in the majority for most of their run. Where right off the bat, she's in the majority in the original Hunapi tribe. They're able to hold the numbers to vote out Drew Christie at the one tribal they go to there. After that, she gets a pretty good swap to where she's reunited with Baylor. They're also able to align with John and Jacqueline, and through that, they hold the numbers on their swap tribe. And carrying over to the merge, that alliance holds true once again, taking out Josh and Jeremy back to back, and they're able to run a decent chunk of the game there, and they're able to break up John and Jacqueline at the final 6. However, I do think from the final 5 on, her game crumbles to where at the final 5, she loses Baylor after an idol play. That's obviously not great. And she's vulnerable at the final 4 to where she probably gets voted out had Keith won immunity, though is able to get around that. And again, she can't really win the game at the end. I feel like there aren't really many people that are willing to vote for her outside of Baylor, obviously, to where we even see Reed at Final Tribal voting for Jacqueline simply out of spite, which I think is pretty funny. But I do think Missy encapsulates this tier pretty well, to where while she didn't have the most win equity in the world, unlike people like Sam, for instance, I do think the fact that she had as much agency as she did, the fact that she was in the majority for as much of the game as she was, is a big reason why she's at the top of this tier of players who were active or were in the majority for decent chunks of their season, but couldn't really win the game or had other factors get involved there, to where she's here number 34. Now moving on to number 33, and we're now moving on to a different grouping of players, as these are essentially second in commands. These are players who were in the majority for almost the entire season, and were also closely aligned with people who did dominate the game, even though they did not dominate the game themselves. However, they didn't win the game either, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 33, we actually have probably the one that had the least amount of control in the game, and that is Stephanie LaGrosa from Survivor Guatemala. And Stephanie was pretty much in the majority for the entire game, being closely aligned with Rafe, who pretty much dominated the game with him. However, I do feel like Rafe was more out in front compared to Stephanie, where I feel like she was more so Rafe's second in command. But even so, she's in the majority, working alongside Rafe there, taking out Brooke, taking out Margaret, all without too much difficulty there. They get the numbers after the merge, and they pretty much begong a lot of the old Yashas one by one. And for the most part, she has a pretty smooth ride during a lot of the game, not really being endangered that much. However, I think there are several major issues with Stephanie here. One is the fact that I think Rafe kind of controls her endgame, where we see Rafe building this bond with Danny around the final 6, and through Rafe wanting to keep Danny, that forces Stephanie to cut people that were better for her game, people like Judd at the final 6, even Cindy at the final 5. And then you have the final 4 round where they end up voting out Lydia over Danny, which is all pretty crazy there. And while Stephanie does vote out these people, I feel like these are all pretty suboptimal moves for her game, as these are all people who probably were more aligned with her than Rafe. And through that, she also burns them to the point where they don't want to vote for her at the end. And I think that leads us to the other issue, which is her win equity. Now, a lot of that is due to this anti-returnee bias, where it seemed like she was pretty unlikely to win, even if she played a better game due to her being a returning player. Though at the same time, you could also argue that her being a returning player helped her in the game. It allowed her to be in the majority early on through her reputation from Palau, where she was pretty well liked at that point. So I think even that is a bit of a double-edged sword, but I think the fact that she also burned Judd and Cindy along the way also didn't help her case either. So I do think the fact that she struggles to win most jury scenarios is another key issue for her. but it's largely the fact that she doesn't really get her way, actually does things against her best interest in multiple points, that leaves her at the bottom of the second in command tier to where she's here at number 33. Now moving on to number 32, and we have another second in command, someone else who I also think struggles to win at the end, and someone who didn't necessarily get their way at all points, but I do think there are some more impressive elements to their game, and that is Albert from Survivor South Pacific. And similar to Stephanie, I would also consider Albert a second in command, this time to coach. And again, he was in the majority for pretty much the entire game, where he's in a pretty good spot on the original Upolu. They vote out Christine. They vote out Stacy without too much difficulty. Things get a bit more complicated the following round, where he and Sophie try to save Michaela, but are unsuccessful in doing so, which is a pretty big knock to his game, but he's still part of the majority afterwards. And we see the Upolus gain the numbers after the merge, after Cochrane Flitz, which I don't really give Albert that much credit for. I feel like that was more so coach's work, and also the Savai's not really managing Cochrane that well, but after that, they do have the majority and they begong the old Savai's one by one until it's just them. And after that, I do think Albert makes a pretty impressive move at the final five, where he's able to convince Brandon to give up immunity and hand it over to him, which is all pretty impressive, as obviously they needed to get out Brandon if he wanted any shot again towards the end. And the fact that he's able to convince Brandon to give him the immunity necklace is all pretty good work there. Now after that, they do face some adversity with Ozzy coming back to the game, to where Albert probably gets voted out final four had Ozzy won final immunity, but they're able to get him out there. And then we get to the final three of him, Coach, and Sophie, where Albert just blatantly loses. And I feel like win equity is a major issue for Albert. It didn't seem like the jury really respected him that much, where he kind of came off as his used car salesman, and he obviously has a pretty bad final trial performance that just further sinks him. So I don't think Albert was set up well to win the game at the end. And I feel like there are also points where Albert is not really getting his way, with the Michaela round in particular being pretty bad, but beyond that, I feel like he's in the majority for pretty much the entire game, and also has that impressive move of convincing Brandon to give him the immunity necklace. I feel like those things were enough to have him above Stephanie, even though I feel like he can't really win at the end, to where he's here at number 32. Now moving on to number 31, and we have yet another second in command that couldn't really win at the end, but still was pretty involved in the actual gameplay. And here we have Jervis, and this is his game from Blood vs. Water. And Jervis is another one who was pretty much in the majority of the entire game, where early on the original Galongs, he is aligned with Tyson, and they're able to get through that all right. After the swap, they're able to pick up all the singles in the game, the people who had already lost all their loved ones, and through that sets them up pretty well coming to the merge, where they flip the game against the Aris and Tina group, picking them off one by one. And from that point on, it's pretty smooth sailing for Jervis. Now we get to the final seven, where they're able to flip Sierra to take out Caleb. That's all pretty good. But I think from the final six on, things get a bit more rocky for him, where at the final six, he actually pushes away Sierra to the point where she ends up flipping back to the Hayden and Katie side. And that eventually results in it going to rocks, to where had that rock draw not gone Jervis's way, then he would have been in a lot of danger moving forward. Though fortunately they end up winning out there. And then afterwards, they're in the majority once again. They take out Hayden, they take out Sierra. Mind you, he's the minority target the entire time, which I think is largely a result of him just being pretty cocky and someone who didn't really rub certain people the right way. And obviously they do have a bit of a roadblock with Tina coming back to the game, but even then they're able to take care of her. And then we get to the end where Jervis just loses. I feel like Jervis is another person who really struggles with winning a jury vote in a lot of scenarios. It seemed like he did rub a decent amount of people the wrong way. And through that, I feel like he really struggles to win in a lot of final three scenarios here. So I do feel like Jervis kind of fits into this tier as well. Someone who was a second in command, but couldn't really win the game at the end. However, I do feel like Jervis was more involved in the majority compared to Albert or Stephanie. I feel like there were more points where he was getting his way. And while I feel like there was some bad play with Jervis at points, I feel like the fact that he was able to hold on to control for pretty much the entire game was enough to have him here at number 31. Now moving on to number 30, and we have yet another second in command. However, I think this person has a bit more to highlight on their own compared to the people we just talked about. By number 30, we do have Tasha. This is obviously her game from Survivor Cambodia. And I think the thing about Tasha is, while she was a second in command to Jeremy for a lot of the game, I think there are a few points where we see her acting on her own, where we see at the first swap where she's separated from Jeremy. I think she does pretty good work there and flipping over Ave Maria, and through that they are able to hold the numbers where they take out PG and Jeff Varner there. So I feel like that's a pretty good stretch of her game, and there are obviously some points after the merge where she's voting against Jeremy's, like during the Sierra round where she was part of the plan to try to blindside Steven Fishback until Jeremy decides to use his idol on Steven. However, I do think by the end of the game, she was clearly in lockstep with Jeremy the rest of the way, where we see them voting together for pretty much the end game there. And I think win equity is another massive issue, a reason why she isn't higher, where it doesn't seem like she wins in any scenario. It doesn't seem like the jury really respected her that much. But despite that, she doesn't really do much to get rid of Jeremy by the end. So I do think that's a bit of an issue for her and a reason why she is around this point in the list. However, the reason she is at least higher than the people we just talked about is she did get her way at a couple points, where I feel like her getting her way after the swap was a big highlight for her. Even after the merge, we see her being willing to not vote with Jeremy during the Sierra round. I think those things were enough to have her above some of these other people, but the fact that she couldn't win at the end is the reason why she's here number 30. Now moving on to number 29, and very similar to Redemption Island, we actually have two runners up from the same season back to back, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 29, we have Sabrina from Survivor One World. And I feel like Sabrina pretty perfectly fits into this tier, where she was a second in command to Kim for pretty much the entire season, was in the majority for pretty much the entire season there, where they vote out Nina, the one tribal they go to before the merge, and then after the merge, we see Kim decide to side with the women, and through that, they essentially run the table, voting out a lot of the men one by one, and then once it's down to just the women, they vote out Alicia at the final 5, and Christina at the final 4. There really isn't that much to say here in terms of Sabrina's game, where obviously the biggest issue is she never really considers flipping against Kim at any point, where it seems like she was perfectly fine just going to the end with Kim in a spot to where she clearly loses. And on top of that, I think a reason why she's below the next person we'll be talking about is that I feel like Sabrina probably would have been cut at Final 4 had Christina won Final Immunity, where it did seem like Kim was more loyal to the next person we'll be talking about. Even though I would argue that Sabrina had more win equity to where she actually got 2 votes at the end, she actually ended up getting second place, which is interesting there. But beyond that, it was never going to be enough to win this season. She was always going to lose to Kim anyway. But it's for those reasons that I have her here at number 29. Now moving on to number 28, and we have the other runner-up from One World, and here we have Chelsea. And I feel like Chelsea's game is extremely similar to Sabrina's, where she essentially aligns with Kim from very early on, and they just run the table from beginning to end. Now, there are technically more points where Chelsea's in danger, where at the final 5, she is the minority target there, where it was a 3-2 vote, though obviously Kim was always siding with her anyway. Though at the same time, I do think Kim was more loyal to Chelsea, where I feel like there were more points in the season where we saw Kim consulting Chelsea over what to do. So I feel like that's a major reason why I have her above Sabrina, even though Sabrina technically got more votes than her at the end, to where Chelsea got 0 votes. I do think that's a factor there. That, and also I feel like had Kim been cut before the end, that Chelsea's probably the most likely winner of the season, considering it seemed like people associated Chelsea with Kim more than they did with Sabrina. So I do feel like that was enough to have Chelsea above Sabrina, even though they're very similar and they're back-to-back on this list. But Chelsea is here number 28. Now moving on to number 27, and we have the final person in this second command grouping, and here we have Becky from Survivor Cook Island. And I feel like Becky also perfectly encapsulates this grouping here, someone who was in the majority for pretty much the entire game and was clearly working with a dominant force, that being Yule, where we see them bonding very early on in their original Puka Puka tribe, and then after the swap, they're once again working in lockstep there, where they take out a lot of the outsiders in Cecilia and Cowboy and Flicka there. And I feel like Becky is very well positioned within Yule's power structure. Though at the same time, I don't think Becky was simply along for the ride. I feel like there are multiple points where Yule was consulting Becky there. Yule even talks in his exit press about how he very much considered Becky an equal in his power structure. So I feel like that was a major reason why she is this high in this grouping here. And also the fact that they are in the majority for the entire game, where we see the mutiny happening, where through that they pick up Ozzy. After the merge, we see Yule being able to flip over Penner there, and they're able to run the table afterwards, where Becky is pretty safe during a lot of the stretch there. Though obviously at the final 4, she's essentially forced to go into fire after Ozzy wins immunity and Yule has his god idol, and we all saw how that played out. Though obviously she does get to the end where she gets 0 votes. Though I think what's interesting about Becky is that while she does get 0 votes at the end, I do think she was actually kind of a jury threat, to where had she gotten to the end against anyone other than Yule, she probably gets a lot of the votes that Yule ended up getting, where it seemed like a lot of the people that Yule had good bonds with and a lot of people that Yule got the jury votes from are also people that Becky was good with and people that also respected Becky as well. So I actually think Becky would have gotten a decent amount of jury votes in other Final 3 scenarios, though a major exception to that is Adam, who voted for Yule mostly due to a deal that Yule made with him, a deal that Becky did not make. So I do think to that end, she doesn't get Adam's vote. And actually, I think that actually makes it hard for her to actually pull out the win in an Aussie Final 3, to where her best case scenario would have been a Final 2 against Sundra, though obviously with how the Final 4 played out, that would have been pretty hard for her to get. So at the end of the day, I feel like Becky was probably not set up to actually win the game, but she's still someone who a lot of the jury seem to respect. She's also someone who I think had plenty of agency across the game, working very closely with Yule, someone that Yule very much considered an equal in his alliance. And through that, I think Becky is at the top of the second in command tier, though obviously not too much above that to where she's here at number 27. Now moving on to number 26, and we're now moving on to a different grouping of players, as I feel like these are players who are either really active in the game and had a decent amount of control across the game, or were in pretty powerful positions for a lot of it, but are just a step below the top tier of players we'll be talking about soon. It's just a matter of ordering them. By number 26, we probably have the rockiest game out of these people, and definitely one of the most famous Survivor players in history. But at number 26, we do have Parvati Shallow, and this is her game from Heroes vs. Villains. And I know Parvati is very much celebrated in the fandom, and I do think she is a fantastic player, one of the greatest Survivor players ever. However, I do think her game on the season is really rocky, where I feel like there were multiple points where she was in danger, and there was some questionable stuff along with that. Or early on, she's not really in the majority on the original Villains tribe, where her and Russ are kind of on the outskirts there, where it feels like more so Boss and Rob and Sandra are in control of that initial tribe. And while she gets through the Randy round alright, we then get to the Tyson round where her and Russell are in direct danger, where the plan is to split the votes onto Russell and Parvati, where she was the main target there, to where had there not been an idol, she would have gone home. However, she does get saved by Russell's idol, which is obviously in itself a pretty big knock, the fact that she needed someone else to play an idol for her. But on top of that, she also needed Tyson to mess up the plan by voting for her instead of Russell. Or had Tyson simply stuck to his assignment, then it would have resulted in a 3-3 tie where Russell goes out on the revote. So she does get lucky not only by the idol play, but also Tyson essentially voting himself out of the game. And I would give Russell more credit for getting Tyson to vote himself out compared to her. So on the whole, I think that's a pretty rocky round. But I feel like after that, she does enter the majority alliance, where the following round, her and Russell are able to flip over Jerry and Coach. They vote out Rob and take control of the Villains tribe moving forward. That's all pretty good. And then we get to the merge where the Villains are able to get the numbers. Now, obviously there's some wonkiness in this where you have JT handing over the idol to Russell due to him thinking that there was a women's alliance controlling the Villains tribe, and you have Russell handing over JT's idol to her when Parvati already had an idol, meaning Parvati had 2 idols to use in that round, and she obviously plays both of them, playing one on Sandra, playing one on Jerry, with the one on Jerry being the more effective one and idling out JT. And obviously that's pretty good, the fact that she's able to make this effective idol play. However, I don't love the fact that she used both idols there and wasting one of them on Sandra, as we see later on that Russell's pretty annoyed at Parvati for having a second idol to play. And while Parvati's still in the majority afterwards, she does become a bigger threat moving forward, and there are multiple rounds where Parvati's in danger. We're at the final 9, she becomes the main target of the heroes there, and you even had Sandra who was willing to flip over. However, she's saved by Russell convincing Candace to flip over, negating that. You also have the final 7 round where she's blindsided when Danielle goes home, losing one of her closest allies, and is clearly being a play to make Russell closer to her and not really giving her any options moving forward. That's not particularly great. And then you have her winning the next couple of immunities, where she wins immunity at Final 6, Final 5, all in spots to where she probably gets voted out had she not won immunity there. So I feel like the fact that Parvati's a pretty big target in those rounds is pretty bad in my eyes. And then you have Final 4 immunity, where while Jerry became the bigger target by that point due to Russell wanting her to be on the jury over Parvati, Jerry was also really close to winning that Final 4 immunity, literally by inches, and had Jerry won that immunity challenge, then Parvati would have gone home over her. So I feel like in general, Parvati's endgame is kind of rocky to where there are points where she needs to win immunity, and in general, I feel like there are multiple points where Russell's outplaying her. And beyond that, you also have win equity, where I feel like it would have been very hard for Parvati to win this season, where the only way she wins is the final 2 against Russell, which wasn't happening. Where beyond that, it seemed like a lot of the jury was really angry at Parvati and was unwilling to give her or Russell the win by the end of it. So I do feel like that's also a pretty big issue. And you can make the argument that she should be lower considering the amount of times where she was in danger, considering the amount of times where she was being outplayed. However, at the end of the day, I feel like Parvati still had a lot of agency across the season. She was not simply being a second in command to Russell, she was actively playing the game at points, where we see during that double idol play, where while you can question whether that was the right move for her, I feel like that was still a moment where she was playing on her own. And even beyond that, you have her building bonds with Danielle and definitely trying to play her own game beyond just simply following Russell. So I feel like to that end, I feel like Parvati is a step above these other second in commands, and a reason why she is this high on the list. But I still feel like she's still someone who couldn't really win at the end, still had plenty of rocky roads along the way, and because of that, she's here at number 26. Now moving on to number 25, and we have a pretty similar player, someone who was not necessarily safe at all points, but was still pretty active in the game. And here we have Tai Trang from Survivor Co. Wrong. And Ty's another pretty interesting player where I feel like he has a pretty rocky start and is able to turn around by the end of it to a degree where, like I said early on, he is in an interesting spot in the original Beauty tribe where he's pretty aligned with Caleb, but beyond that, he's not really in the core of that, where I feel like the likes of Anna and Julia are more so in the core of that. However, he is still pretty safe early on. We didn't get to the swap where he is down in numbers initially with him and Anna being the only beauties there. However, he's able to build good enough bonds with the old bronze to where he's able to remain safe, being able to vote out Anna first and then Peter at the next tribal. Though I think his game gets rocky again around the early merge where initially he is on the outs when Nick gets voted out. That's not particularly great. He's also on the outs during the Debbie round where he, Jason, and Scott tried to take out Sydney but unsuccessful. And it's not until the final 8 that he is finally brought back into the majority where he is convinced by Aubrey to flip on Jason and Scott, voting out Scott there, which I think is a pretty questionable move, as I feel like Scott was someone who was pretty loyal to Ty and also was a pretty big shield in front of him. And I feel like he would have been better off trying to keep Scott in the game moving forward. So I feel like that's a pretty questionable move. We get to the final 7 where, well, he votes in the majority again to take out Julia. He's also the minority target, which is not great there. Though from the final 6 on, he is pretty safe in the game to where he is part of a final 3 deal with Joe and Aubrey. And obviously that's thwarted by Joe getting medevac to the final 5 and then Michelle winning immunity at the final 4. Though even then he makes a pretty questionable move at the final 4 where instead of simply voting out Aubrey, who at that point was a bigger jury threat compared to Sydney, he instead forces a fire making challenge by voting against Sydney, which I think is a pretty questionable move. Definitely makes it harder for him to win the game by going up against Aubrey. And sure enough, that's what happens, where Sydney loses the fire making challenge and he's up against Aubrey and Michelle to where he gets 0 votes. And obviously that's not particularly great. And in general, I think Ty's game is really weird, where on one hand, I think he's a very active player. He's someone who I think was making moves at certain points. Though at the same time, I think some of the moves he makes are pretty questionable, like him turning against Scott Pollard at the final 8. I don't love that move. Him saving Aubrey at the final 4 is also a pretty questionable move. However, I think another thing to point out is, while he does get 0 votes against Aubrey and Michelle, I don't think he is a bigger jury threat in other scenarios to where, had he gotten to the end against Sydney, I think he probably gets some votes there, as even though he did burn Scott and Jason on the way out, they were still willing to vote for him in certain scenarios, so I think Ty was actually not that dead in a jury vote. Even if he got to his ideal final 3 of Joe and Aubrey, while I think he still loses to Aubrey, I think he also gets some votes there as well. So I think Ty is someone who's not necessarily a GOAT, and I think he's someone who definitely could have come close to winning in certain scenarios, and was obviously a pretty active player in the game. However, I think considering that he doesn't necessarily make the best moves at every opportunity, and there were still points where he was on the outs, I figured number 25 was as high as I can put him. Now moving on to number 24, and we have another player who was probably not in the majority the entire time, and there were definitely points where they were in danger. However, they were still a pretty active player and someone that made some impressive moves along the way. But here we have Spencer Bledsoe from Survivor Cambodia, and I think Spencer also played a pretty impressive game considering the circumstances here. Now, it's not to say that he was necessarily in the majority the entire time, where, again, he has a very rocky start to his season, where right at the bat, he is part of the initial plan to take out Vetus at that first tribal. I think you give him a lot of credit for that move, but then almost immediately afterwards, the game flips on him to where him and Sharon are suddenly on the bottom, and the vote is between the two of them in the next tribal. He barely survives in a 5-4 vote. And then we get to the swap where he is once again not in the greatest spot in the world. However, he's eventually able to survive the Monica round. And he's once again in a bad spot on his second swap tribe where they do go to tribal there. And it did seem like for a lot of the round that he was in the most danger there, though the vote does eventually flip to take out Wu instead. And I don't really give Spencer that much credit for saving himself there, as it felt like it was more so people coming together to break up Wu and Savage there. So really Spencer's on the bottom for pretty much the first half of the season. And there's definitely a debate for him being lower simply due to how much he was on the bottom. However, the reason he's this high on the list is I feel like he really turns it around in the post-merge, where I feel like from the merge on, he's able to really find his footing in the game, where at the merge, he is able to flip the game on Cass and Sierra, splitting the vote there. And while he's on the outs during the Savage round, that was in a spot to where everyone was on the outs due to the massive idol play, but whatever. We then get to the final 11, where he's part of the Wigglesworth blindside. And then we get that final 10, where he's actually able to break away from the majority alliance and able to orchestrate this massive blindside against Stephen Fishback, and he's able to get most of the votes onto him there, and that's all pretty impressive until Jeremy decides to use his idol on Steven, and in turn, Sierra's taken out instead. So while you had to knock Spencer a little bit for the plan not working out, the fact that he was able to put it together to begin with and still be in a good position afterwards is pretty impressive. We get that final 9 where he's finally able to pull the trigger on Steven, taking him out there. Final 8 takes out Joe. But then we get to final 7 where he does make a bit of a questionable move by voting out Abby Maria there. Now granted, Tasha was the backup target instead, though I think if he wanted to actually win the game, he probably needed to take Abby deeper into the game. Now we get to the final 6 where they do face a obstacle with Kimmy flipping, which is obviously not great. And the plan was to target Jeremy there. And we see Jeremy spending a lot of the round not convinced that Kimmy had flipped and not realizing that he needs to play his idol. And I do have to give Spencer some credit for being able to convince Spencer that Kimmy had flipped when Jeremy was so convinced that Kimmy was still by their side, to where Jeremy is convinced by Spencer to playing his idol there, ensuring that they went out on that vote. And from that point on, it's a pretty smooth ride for Spencer where they take out Keith at final 5, and then final 4, they vote out Wentworth after she fails to win final immunity. So on the whole, I feel like Spencer's game, particularly in the post-merge, is somewhat impressive. The fact that he's able to be as flexible as he is, the fact that he's as active in the game as he is, all while being the majority for pretty much the entire time. And I think I'm probably more impressed by Spencer's game, the fact that he was able to turn his game around so much in the post-merge that really elevates him above some of these other players who really had bad stretches to their game alongside good ones here. Now, the reason he's not higher is really his win equity, to where he really just couldn't win the game by the end of it. And a lot of it is due to like these notions of him being too young, especially with this being such an older cast, to where it would have been hard for them to give the money to a kid per se. So I do think Spencer is kind of harmed by that. But beyond that, also the fact that he was on the outs for as much a game as he was, where he was barely surviving during a lot of the pre-merge, I couldn't really have him any higher due to that, but I still find this game impressive enough to where he's here at number 24. Now moving on to number 23, and I consider having this person a little bit lower. However, after thinking about it, I figured they had a bit more agency than I gave them some credit for, and we actually have one of the appearances of someone who will appear on this list twice, and that is Amanda Kimmel, and this is her game from Survivor Micronesia. And I consider having Amanda in the second command here, considering she was part of this dominant alliance in the Black Widow Brigade, but was not the most active in that, to where I feel like Parvati and Suri were more involved in the success of that alliance. However, even so, I feel like Amanda was still a somewhat impressive player across the season, where initially she is part of the majority on the Favorites tribe, where they take out Yao-Man at the second tribal, and through her connections with Parvati, James, and Ozzy, they really are able to hold control early on there. After the swap, she is once again in a pretty good spot where they vote out a lot of the old fans one by one, along with Amy right before the merge. And then after the merge, she's in the majority once again, taking out Liza at that first tribal. But then we get to the final 9 where Ozzy is blindsided, who was technically her showmance for a lot of the early game. And I'm kind of conflicted over whether this is a knock to Amanda's game, as on one hand, she technically does not vote out Ozzy there. She votes for Jason in that round. And with Ozzy being closer to her than the other Black Widow members, this should technically be a knock to her game. However, she did supposedly know about the plan at least, and supposedly even enabled it to happen to begin with. However, I still think it benefits other people within the Black Widow Brigade more so than Amanda in particular. But after this move, this really solidifies the Black Widow Brigade moving forward, and they're able to pick off the outsiders one by one. And even within the Black Widow Brigade, she does have a final 3 deal with Suri and Parvati, meaning she does technically have a smooth path to the end. Though I will also say that the final 6 is a massive knock to her game, where despite her having this final 3 deal, we see Suri and Parvati being so ready to flip on her after Eric wins immunity, and we see them going to Natalie and Alexis to flip the game on Amanda. And it really comes down to Amanda like scraping to find an idol at the last moment and playing it on herself there, to where had that not happened, she would have gone home at the final 6. That's really bad for Amanda's game. However, we then get to the final 5 where despite Eric winning immunity again, she's not the target, to where Natalie actually becomes the target instead, though even then they're able to get around that due to Eric giving up immunity there. And then from that point, Amanda does have a pretty smooth ride to the end from that point on, where they take out Natalie at the final 4. And even with the surprise final 2, she's still able to win immunity, takes Parvati to the end. Now, admittedly, from that point on, I think it's kind of hard to see how Amanda outright wins the game, to where it seemed like Parvati was the favorite coming into it, and she supposedly would have lost to Suri as well. However, in this final 2, she's still able to get 3 jury votes out of 8. And Eliza was still very much on the fence to where there could have been a world where Eliza could have voted for Amanda and forced a tie, and who knows what would have happened in that scenario. But I feel like the fact that Amanda came somewhat close to forcing a tie is a bit impressive in my eyes. And while it's hard to see how she outright wins the game, I feel like that's a major factor in why she's above some of these other people in the second command tier. So I do think Amanda, for the most part, played a pretty solid game where she was part of a dominant alliance for most of her run. However, there are a couple of hiccups like the final 6 round and even the final 9 round having some wonkiness with it that leaves her a bit lower on this list, but I still find Amanda's game impressive enough for her to be here at number 23. Now moving on to number 22, and this was another pretty interesting player, as while they're not as active in the game compared to other people we already talked about, I feel like they were extremely safe during so much of the season, and that is Gavin from Edge of Extinction. And I feel like Gavin played a pretty solid game, all things considered. Definitely a pretty consistent game where he's pretty much in the majority of the entire game and is pretty safe during a lot of the game. Where on the original comma, he is in a pretty good spot there, being closely aligned with a lot of the people there, like Eric and Victoria. He's able to remain pretty safe. After the swap, he's also in the numbers to where he votes out Aubrey and later takes out Wendy during the joint tribal. And again, I feel like his pre-merge is pretty consistent there. And then after the merge, he is once again in a pretty good spot where he's able to flip back and forth, where first up they take out Joe at the first tribal, later flips to take out Eric, which admittedly is kind of a questionable move for Gavin, as Eric was someone who was pretty close to him, but he's able to get through that unscathed. He votes out Julia thereafter, votes out David. He is on the outs during the Wentworth blindside, where he was one of the people voting for Aurora, but he's able to flip to take out Warlock at the final 8. At the final 7, he is part of this move to blindside Ron by using his extra vote, and while he's not the main orchestrator of that, he is part of that plan. And he does have a pretty smooth ride to the end, to where even after Chris comes back into the game at the final 6, there are simply bigger targets in the game, like Victoria, Lauren, and Devons. And he does ultimately lose to Chris at the end, which is kind of a knock considering Chris was only in the game for a couple of rounds while Gavin was there the entire time. And I think another issue is he's not really a dominant force in the game, where I feel like there are very few points where he's driving the action. However, despite that, he is also really well positioned to where he has so many connections with so many people on the board to where he's able to remain pretty safe for pretty much the entire season, and is also looped into most of the plans that happen there. So it's kind of strange to where he's not very dominant in the game, but he's also really well positioned and has a very smooth ride during a lot of the game, where he's never in danger at any point, which is even more impressive considering he is on a season like Edge of Extinction that had a lot of power shifts and blindsides along the way. And I think he's also someone who maybe could have won at the end. Now, he obviously loses to Chris, and I think he also loses to Devons, though I think against Lauren, he probably has a shot there, as it did seem like he was the main option for the people that didn't return from the Edge, to where he does get 4 votes at the end. So I do think there is some merit to Gavin's game, and while he's not very dominant, I feel like there's not really a move I can put to his name solely outside of the final 7 Ron move, I guess. I feel like he is still someone who played a very good game, someone who did position himself very well and was able to cultivate relationships that allowed him to get through a lot of the game. I feel like he wasn't simply being used as a goat for a lot of it. So I feel like it's for those reasons that I definitely have him in this grouping to where he's here at number 22. Now moving on to number 21, and this was another player who was pretty active in the game and was mostly safe outside a couple rounds. But number 22, we do have Hannah from Survivor Millennials vs. Gen X. And Hannah was another pretty interesting figure. I feel like she was definitely a pretty major player across a lot of the season there, even though I wouldn't consider her overtly dominant. Where right at the bat in the original Millennials tribe, she is a major swing vote during the first tribal they attend, where despite her being closer to the Adam, Zeke, and Mari side of things, she is pulled into the Mari blind side that happens. And you can question whether that was the right move for her, but the fact that she was pulled into that plan is somewhat impressive on her end. We then get to the swap, where she is in a good spot initially, though is later blindsided when Michaela goes out due to Jay and Will flipping there. That's not particularly great, though she is able to recover after the merge to where she is part of the majority that forms there. They vote on Michelle, they split the votes on Jay and Taylor the following round, and she's part of the Chris blindside that happens at the final 11. We then get to the final 10, where she is in quite a bit of danger there, where the other side does decide to target her. It becomes a 5-5 vote there, and it does go to Rox. And her side does lose out on that vote, where they do ultimately lose Jessica in that spot. And we see her being targeted again the following round. However, this time they are able to get the numbers. They're able to corral the votes onto Zeke. And even then, you have Adam using her idol on her in a spot to where she didn't need it. I feel like that's pretty good. And from that point on, she's in the majority of the rest of the game, where they vote out Will at the final 8, Sunday at the final 7, Jay at the final 6. Now we do get to the final 5, where Adam does approach her about flip the game against David, only for her to back out of that plan, which is obviously not great in the sense that she is taking David deeper into the game in a spot to where David's such a blatant jury threat. Though I think there's also some merit to it, as taking David to the final 4 would guarantee her spot at the end, as David's such a blatant threat in front of her. And we do see that play out, where David fails to win final immunity, and her and Hannah do flip the game against David at that point. Though then we get the final tribal, where she just loses unanimously there, where despite her being a key force in flipping the game on David, the jury just simply didn't recognize that, where instead they gave Adam most of the credit for convincing Ken to turn against David there. So I do think Hannah gets a bit unlucky there. And in general, I think Hannah struggles to win a jury vote in a lot of scenarios there. It didn't seem like the jury really respected her game that much. They didn't really see her gameplay as that solid at the end of the day, but I still think Hannah was a major force on the season. She was a pretty big player there. And while there were a couple points in the season where she was a pretty big target, she was still able to be a key swing vote during multiple points across the season. And I feel like she is a major force in finally flipping the game against David at the very end of it. So I do give Hannah quite a bit of credit for the game that she played on the season, though obviously winning at the end was a big issue, to where she's here at number 21. Now moving on to number 20, and we have another person who fits pretty clearly into this mold, and here we have Carolyn Rivera from Survivor Worlds Apart. And I feel like Carolyn was also a pretty active player, definitely someone who had some interesting highlights to their game, even though they couldn't quite win by the end of it. Now on the original white collar tribe, she's not in the greatest spot in the world, to where she is the minority target, but is able to get through that, voting out So. After the swap, she's able to integrate pretty well with the no color majority there, is able to survive over Max, voting the majority there. And then after the merge, she's once again part of the majority group, where while they do have a setback at that merge round, she's able to hold the numbers thereafter, voting out the old no colors one by one, all while being part of this core alliance of Rodney, Will, and Tyler that's able to try to flip the game at Mike at the final 9, though that's obviously when Mike starts to go on his immunity run, so there's that. And we do eventually see that alliance turning on each other, though I do think Carolyn does some impressive work at aligning with Mike to ensure that she's well positioned with Mike in the case that Mike eventually wins out, where we get to the final 7 where she wins immunity, and in theory opening up Mike to be taken out there, though obviously Mike has an idol to play for that one round, though even then she's able to be part of this Tyler blindside where her and Sierra are able to flip the game on Tyler there, though she's in quite a bit of danger at the final 6 where Mike wins immunity again, and she does become the main target there, where the most of the votes are drawn to her and she has to play an idol on herself, which is obviously pretty bad there. But through that, her and Mike are able to take out Dan. At the final 5, she also faces a setback there where you have Mike siding against her and Sierra over the Rodney and Will side. And through that, she has to vote out Sierra at that point. And then we get to the final 4 where Mike wins immunity again. And this time, she is like one of the main targets, though through her connection with Mike, she is able to get into a fire making challenge where she beats Rodney there. And she does ultimately lose at the end, though she does still get a vote at the end from Sierra, which I think is something to mention here. Not to mention that while she does lose against Mike, I do think she has a better shot against other people, where I think she probably wins the final 3 against Will and Dan. That's something. Even against Rodney, I think there's a decent chance that she pulls it out there, though it's certainly up in the air. So I do think Carolyn still had some winning scenarios by the end of it, even though she wasn't the biggest jury threat in the world on paper there. And I do think her endgame is pretty rocky, to where I can't really have her any higher than number 20. Now moving on to number 19, and we are once again doing these pairings of 2 runners-up from the same season, as I feel like these people play pretty similar games. But number 19, we do have Chrissy from Survivor HHH, and I feel like Chrissy's game was pretty solid for the most part, where she was definitely in the majority for a lot of it, and was a pretty big factor in how the game played out. Though there are a couple of issues to bring up here. Where early on she is initially on the outs on the Heroes tribe, though she's able to rectify that pretty quickly through her building bonds with the likes of Ben and Alan, and through her having an idol for the first round, she's pretty safe during the Katrina round. After the swap, she's able to connect with Ryan, who had given her the idol from the first tribal, and they build a pretty good bond there. And through adding in JP, they're essentially able to take control of that swap tribe, which is pretty crazy considering it should have been a 2-2-1 split there. but instead they're able to take out Rourke, who was supposed to be the swing vote there, which is pretty good. And even coming into the merge, she is again in a pretty good spot initially, where the heroes and hustlers are able to team up and pick off the healers one by one. Mind you, she is the minority target during the Jessica round, but they're able to get through that all right. But it's really not until the Final 9 that she does lose control, where at the Final 9 we see a new majority alliance form, that being the Roundtable Alliance, and they do flip the game on Ryan, Chrissy, and JP, taking out JP at that next round, and she is kind of on the outs at the Final 8, where while she does survive due to the Roundtable flipping on Joe Mena, she's not really included in that vote. She throws her vote onto Ashley there, which is not particularly great. Though it's around the Final 7 that her and Ryan reassert control, where at that point Ben becomes a pretty big threat, and through them building a Final 3 deal with Devin, they're essentially able to ride their way towards the end of the game, with the major issue being that they're unable to get out Ben due to Ben finding idol after idol after idol, which is all pretty unfortunate there. Though even that, the Final 4, Ben was supposed to be going home until they decided to throw in forced fire making. That basically means that Ben is able to get to the end, which is obviously very unfortunate for Chrissy, means that she can't get her ideal Final 3 of Devin and Ryan, though even then she probably loses that anyway. And I do think win equity is a massive concern for Chrissy, where I don't think she really wins at the end. It didn't seem like the jury respected her that much. And I do think she had some pretty questionable jury management at points, but she does manage to be a pretty big player across a lot of the season there, being a pretty big factor across most of the rounds. So really, the main points where she's on the outs is at the Final 9 and Final 8. And there were also some points earlier on where she was the target by the minority, but she was able to scrape through that. But I still find Chrissy's game here mostly impressive, with probably her biggest issue being her win equity, but it was still enough for her to be here number 19. Now moving on to number 18, and we have someone who I just mentioned, but we do have Ryan, also from HHH. And I feel like Ryan's game is probably around the similar level to Chrissy's, where he is also in the majority for a lot of it, and is closely working with Chrissy for a lot of it. Where early on, he's in a pretty good spot on the original Hustlers tribe, where he has pretty good relationships with most of the people there, particularly Devin, Allie, and Rourke. And through that, he's in a pretty good spot there. They vote out Simone, they vote out Patrick, not too much difficulty there. After the swap, he's again in a pretty good spot where he bonds with Chrissy due to him having given her the one-round idol he gotten at the beginning of the game. Though at the same time, I do think this is a bit of a rocky stretch for him, where he does vote out Rourke, where he is part of the majority there, but he also ends up burning Allie, someone he had a pretty good relationship with. And I feel like he kind of mismanages Allie afterwards, to where he's essentially forced to vote her out next, to where I feel like it would have been better for him to try to smooth that over, but he is still in the majority afterwards. After the merge, he is again working alongside Chrissy and is able to take out a lot of the healers initially, though the game does flip on him at the Final 9, where he is blindsided the JP vote, on the outs again during the Joe vote. Again, very similar position to Chrissy there. And around the Final 7, he is able to reintegrate, and from that point on, they try to get up Ben, but is unsuccessful there, and it's largely due to Ben idling his way to the end that essentially makes it so he can't win the game at the end, which is all pretty unfortunate. And again, I feel like Ryan and Chrissy are very similar. Both of them were in similar positions for a lot of the game, being in power positions at points, but also being on the outs around the same points. And I think what separates Ryan from Chrissy is, one, I feel like Ryan was a bit safer in the game, where, as I said with Chrissy, there were a few points where she was in danger and was being targeted by the minority, but was able to get through it. Ryan was never really in danger throughout a lot of the game, where the only time he gets votes is during the Joe Mena round, but even then, those are negated by an idol. And I think another thing that elevates Ryan above Chrissy is, I think he has a bit more win equity than Chrissy, where while Chrissy does get more votes at the end compared to Ryan in the actual Final 3, if we are looking at the Final 3 they were planning to get, and the one that they probably should have gotten had it not been for forced fire making, that being Ryan versus Chrissy versus Devin, I think Ryan has more of a shot of winning against Devin in that scenario, whereas I feel like Chrissy was clearly meant to be the third in that. So I think that's a major reason why I have Ryan above Chrissy, is that he was better set up to win in the Final 3 that they were planning for. It's just through the forced fire making twist that really ruins their chance of winning at the game at the end. But still, there were a couple points where they're on the outs, and I wouldn't say they were an overly dominant player, which is why he's here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have another player who was in a pretty good spot for a lot of the game, but has some issues to bring up, and here we have Lisa Welchel from Survivor Philippines. And I think Lisa played a pretty solid game, all things considered, though obviously comes up short by the end of it, where right at the bat she is not initially in a good spot on the original Tandang, where her and Artis are initially on the outs, though as the pre-merge goes along, she's able to reintegrate to where she becomes part of the new majority that forms there, sort of leaving Scoopin on the outs there, which is pretty funny. And once the merge hits, she is again part of the majority group. They split the votes on Penner and RC, and is later part of the Jeff Kent boot. However, she is blindsided at the final 9, losing out on the artist vote, which is pretty bad for her. Though I think she recovers pretty well afterwards, where moving forward, she ends up aligning with Scoopin, Malcolm, and Denise, and through that, they essentially run the table from the final 8 on, where Lisa is a pretty major factor in how that endgame plays out. However, sort of similar to Scoopin, she does have some missteps here, where at the final 7, they do try to make a final 4 deal with Penner, but due to Penner decline, they have to vote him out. And then at the final 5, we have Lisa recognizing that her and Scoopin's best case scenario is going up against Abby, and she does try to make a final 3 deal with Abby, though Scoopin is ultimately the one that shuts that down, and through that she does vote out Abby Maria there, which I do think is a major knock to Lisa, the fact that she does something that's against her best interest. Mind you, I do fault Scoopin more for that, as Scoopin was the one who more actively shut out Abby Maria in a spot to where he thought he would just beat Malcolm and Denise, whereas Lisa was a bit more aware of her situation at that point. And I think her agreeing to vote out Abby basically means she can't really win at the end, as she loses to both Malcolm and Denise. And to be fair, she does push to get Malcolm out the final 4 and is successful in getting that, though at the same time, she was in a spot to where she was going to lose either way. Though I think what puts Lisa much higher in the list compared to Michael Scoopin is I think Lisa does win in that final 3 against her, Scoopin, and Abby Maria. Then also I feel like Lisa was in a more consistent position for more of the game compared to Scoopin, where, as I said, Scoopin was not a great spot towards the tail end of the pre-merge there. I feel like Lisa is someone who was in a better position for more of the pre-merge, and while she's on the outs for the artist vote, she's able to reintegrate almost immediately afterwards. And I feel like from that point on, her and Scoopin are a pretty major force in how they drive a lot of that game, and have a much more secure path to the end of the game compared to Malcolm and Denise, who were seen as bigger threats at certain points. So I feel like on the whole, Lisa does play a pretty impressive game and did have a winning scenario towards the end of it. The problem is that she kind of let that go to waste due to Scoopin. So I feel like for those reasons, I can't have her any higher than number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have another player who was in a pretty powerful spot for a lot of the game. However, this person also didn't have as much win equity than someone like Lisa or Ryan, but we do have Sash from Survivor Nicaragua. And I feel like Sash plays a pretty solid game, all things considered, though there are some hiccups along the way. But right at the bat, he's not really in the immediate majority, where initially the tribe is split 5-5. However, that group is able to get the majority after Chase is able to flip over to the Brendan side, and through that, Sash is part of the majority, taking out Shannon at that first tribal. After the swap, he is once again in a pretty good spot where he's able to build a pretty strong bond with Marty, to the point where Marty even gives Sash his idol, which I find pretty impressive there. And he's part of the majority for both the Kelly Bruno and Jill rounds. That's all pretty good. And then after the merge, he is again part of the majority for the first few votes. However, I do think he makes a misstep at the final 11 by voting out Marty there, someone who he had a pretty good relationship with and someone who would have been a good shield for him moving forward. And then the following round, he ends up losing Brenda, having to vote her out there, which I think is also a mismanagement of his position. And then he's harmed again the following round by the double quit, losing Nayanka and Purple Kelly back to back, two of his closest allies there. And this should have put Sash in a really bad spot moving forward. However, I do think he recovers pretty well, where at the final 7, he's able to build a new alliance with Chase, Holly, and Jane, and through that they're able to run the table moving forward, with the one hiccup being Fabio's immunity run, which obviously puts their alliance in a pretty bad spot, as Fabio eventually gets to the end and wins. However, I do think Sash probably loses either way, as I do think Sash struggles to win a jury vote in a lot of scenarios. It seemed like a lot of the jury didn't really respect him that much. You also the mortgage gate situation, which I don't really believe. I don't think Sash actually made a deal with Jane to pay off her mortgage if he let her win, but I do think Sash was set up pretty poorly to actually win by the end, to where even if he had gotten his ideal final 3 of Chase and Holly, that Chase probably wins that. So I don't think Sash was set up well to win the game by the end of it. But he's still someone who faced a lot of adversity during a lot of the season and was still able to recover pretty well. Though I do think he makes a couple mistakes along the way, like voting out Marty and then voting out Brenda. That kind of put him in a spot to be in a bad spot due to double quit to begin with. Then also he doesn't have as much outright control of the game compared to some people we'll be talking about soon, to where he's here number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have another player who was pretty much in the majority of the entire game and was a pretty big factor in how the game played out. However, I think win equity was another massive issue with this person, and here we have Twyla from the Survivor of Vanuatu. And I feel like Twyla also played a pretty impressive game considering her archetype here, where she's essentially the majority of the entire game, and someone who was a pretty big player in how the game played out. But right off the bat, she's in the majority in the original Yes Sir tribe. They vote out Dolly without much issue there. She is technically in danger during the Mia round, but again is in the majority there. Take out Mia, no issue there. After the swap, she is down in numbers, but her and Julie are able to build good enough bonds with Chris and Sarge and Chad to the point where they end up surviving that tribal. They vet out John Kenny. And then coming to the merge, she is a massive swing vote in the game to where she has connections with the men, but also with the women. And obviously she does side with the women and start to pagong the men one by one, which I don't think is the correct move for Twyla here, as we really see a lot of them being burned by Twyla moving forward to where they're unlikely to vote for her on a jury. And even within the Women's Alliance, she's not the most well positioned within that. Though it's around the final 7 that they finally start to turn that around, where her and Scout do decide to flip the game on Leanne and Amy. And through that, they're able to pull in Chris. They're able to pull in Eliza. And the fact that they pull in Eliza is somewhat impressive, considering Eliza and Twyla didn't really get along. And they're able to blindside Leanne at the final 7, Amy at the final 6. And while she's in danger at the final 5, where Eliza decides to work with Julie to target her, she's able to get through that. And by final 4, Twyla's in a pretty good spot to get towards the end of the game, to where unless Eliza were to win out, Twyla is essentially guaranteed final 2, as she obviously has Scout there who would take her to the end, and is also able to build a final 2 deal with Chris to where she would have honored that as well. And sure enough, she does get to a final 3 where both of them are taking her to the end. Chris wins on immunity, takes Twyla to the end, and she just loses at that point. And I do think win equity is a massive issue for Twyla, a big reason why she isn't higher in the list, where she can't really win the game by the end of it. It didn't seem like a lot of people there respected her. And I think some of that is due to her own actions, where she does burn the likes of Sarge and Chad along the way. She would swear on her son. She would also get into fights with Eliza. And she obviously had a pretty bad final trial performance as well, where Chris had told her that she should just be honest and not suck up to anyone, while he did the opposite. And in general, I feel like Twyla was someone who's pretty unlikely to win the game, where her best case scenario would have been a final 2 against Eliza, but even then, I think Eliza probably has a shot of winning. So I don't think Twyla was set up well to win the game, but she was still a pretty big force in how the game played out. She was a massive swing vote at the merge. She obviously was a factor in flipping the game at the final 7, and was in the majority for pretty much the entire game. There was never really a point where she was on the outs per se, but it's the fact that she just couldn't win at the end is a major reason why I dropped her all the way down to number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have another person who was pretty much in the majority for the entire game and kind of made some mistakes that caused him to lose the game. However, I do think this person had more win equity than someone like Twyla, and that person is Dawn Meehan from Survivor Caramoan. And I think Dawn was pretty well positioned for pretty much the entire game, never really being in that much danger of going home, and someone who was very closely working with Cochran, who was a dominant force across the season, and working very closely alongside him as well. We're right at the bat, she's in a pretty good spot on the original favorites tribe. They vote out Francesca without much issue, and they eventually take out Brandon Hans, which is obviously something there. After the swap, she's once again in a pretty good spot. The favorites hold the numbers. They're able to pick off the old fans one by one, like Matt Bischoff and Julia. After the merge, they once again hold the numbers, where they pick up a lot of the outsiders there, starting off with Corinne and Michael Snow. They face some adversity during the Three Amigos tribal, but even then, Dawn herself was pretty safe, to where they always had Philip in front of him as a shield. Sure enough, Phil gets taken out there. And then they just pick off Malcolm and Reynolds back to back. But then after they're gone, they're able to once again hold the numbers. They blindside Andrea at the final 7. And before the final 7, I think Dawn is playing a very strong game, working alongside Cochran there. But I do think she makes a pretty big misstep at the final 6, where she is convinced by Cochran to blindside Brenda, which I think is a pretty bad move for Dawn's game, as I feel like Brenda was closer to her than she was to Cochran. And through her taking out Brenda, I think it really just puts Cochran out in front, to where Cochran's in a much better spot to win the game compared to Dawn. And while they have a smooth ride to the end afterwards, taking out Eddie at the final 4, she gets to the end where she just loses to Cochran. And I feel like the fact that she never considers slipping on Cochran is a pretty big mistake, considering just how massive of a jury threat Cochran was. And I think had Dawn been able to get out Cochran before the end, I think she's probably the most likely winner of the season, as I feel like she probably just inherits a lot of the credit that Cochran got for dominating the game. As even with the Brenda situation, while that's obviously a pretty unfortunate situation that plays out a final tribal, I do think Dawn was not necessarily a GOAT per se. I feel like she was very clearly working as an equal to Cochran for a lot of the game, But I do think Cochrane did outplay her at that Brenda round, and it really just set her up for failure at the very end of the game. But I still find Dawn's game really impressive, where she is a pretty powerful player across a lot of the season, working alongside Cochrane, dominating the game with him. It's just that I think she just lets Cochrane get his way at points that really harm her chances of winning the game, in that she also doesn't really consider cutting Cochrane at any point, is a major reason why she's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we're going back now to the earliest runner-up left on the board to talk about, and here we have Colby Donaldson from the Australian Outback. And I feel like Colby's in a very similar boat to Dawn here, where I feel like he was a co-dominant player in the game alongside Tina, where he's really in the majority for the entire game. Where right at the bat, he is in a good spot in the original Oga course, where he's really in the middle of the Tina group, but also with the Mitchells and Jerrys and Ambers of the world. However, he is later convinced to flip against Mitchell at the third treble that they attend, voting on Mitchell there. And through that, he's essentially part of this new core alliance with Tina and Keith that is able to essentially run the table moving forward. Now, I will also say that Colby is greatly benefited by Michael Scoop getting medevac, to where that allows them to come to the merge tied in numbers, to where had that not happened, then obviously there's still a chance that they can win that immunity challenge and get the tie result anyway, but if they lose that challenge, then they would have been down numbers to where they would have been in a very bad spot moving forward. But through that, they do come to the merge tied in numbers, and they do pretty effective work at ensuring they get the numbers there, where first up, you have Tina letting Keith win immunity, the person who had the most previous votes, and you also have Colby drawing the votes onto him from the Kuchas, which admittedly is probably not the greatest spot either, as had the game ever flipped on them moving forward, then it would just been really easy to get out Colby later on due to him being a big threat. But regardless, they do get the numbers after the merge, and really from that point on, it's mostly smooth sailing to where they're able to bagong the old Kujas one by one. However, they do take some detours along the way, where they vote out Jerry at the final 8, and they also vote out Amber at the final 6. And admittedly, I don't love either of these moves. I feel like these were pretty suboptimal moves, and really could have backfired on Tina and Colby had this been like a more recent season of the show. But instead, the Kuchas just don't put the pieces together, and they never actually flip the game on them anyway. And regardless, I don't think it's great for Colby either, as he didn't want these moves to happen, and it's just a clear case of Colby not getting his way there, as it was more so Tina and Keith pushing to get out Jared at the final 8 and Amber at the final 6. Colby didn't really want to pull the trigger there, so I do have to fault Colby on two fronts here. One, for making a suboptimal move and going along with the plan, but also for not getting his way to begin with and convincing Tina and Keith to stick to the plan and picking up the Kuchas. But along the way, you also have Colby going on a massive immunity run where he wins 5 immunities over the course of the season, never really needing any one of them, which I find somewhat impressive, definitely more so than someone like Ozzy or Brad, where I feel like Colby never really needs any of these immunities outside of the final 3, where even then, he just needed Keith to not win immunity there, but through that, he does win final immunity, and sort of similar to Wu, I think he makes the wrong decision here, where in one case, he beats Keith in an overwhelming fashion. In the other situation, he picks Tina, who he eventually loses to. So I do have to fault Colby quite a bit as well for making the wrong decision there. Though I think unlike Wu, he actually comes closer to beating Tina than Wu did at beating Tony, where it was a 4-3 vote, and a lot of it did come down to final tribal, where Colby could have gotten one more vote from the likes of Jerry, who was pretty open to voting for him at that point. Though you also default Colby for botching it, where he doesn't really manage Jerry well in the final jury questioning, and he sort of just wastes opportunities to get the vote from him, especially when Tina also had a pretty bad final trial performance there. So I do think Colby really just drops the ball at the very end of the game. But I feel like Colby's game is in a lot of ways similar to the likes of Dawn, where he was a co-dominant figure in the game alongside Tina and Keith, though he does have points in the game where he doesn't get his way, like the Jerry and Amber rounds. And even beyond that, you have him sort of getting lucky by the scoop and medevac and then being able to get the numbers after the merge there. But I still feel like Colby's game on the whole is somewhat impressive to where he's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we're finally talking about the greatest player of all time. But at number 12, we do have Russell Hantz, and this is his game from Heroes vs. Villains. And I think Russell's Heroes vs. Villains game is interesting to say the least, where he is a pretty powerful player across a lot of season. He does have a lot of influence over how the game plays out. However, he does have some issues along the way, obviously. Now, right off the bat, he's not part of the initial majority on the Villains tribe, where I feel like the likes of Rob are controlling that tribe initially, whereas I feel like Russell, Parvati, and Danielle are more so on the outs there. And it's not really until the Tyson round that his game starts to turn on, though even then, there was a real shot that that plan could have backfired, where the plan there was to split the votes onto Russell and Parvati, and Russell's plan was to use the idol onto Parvati, but also get Tyson to throw his vote onto Parvati to throw out the vote split to ensure that Tyson would be voted out there. And while this is an impressive maneuver, it's also a very risky one, as had Tyson stuck to his assignment, then Russell would have essentially idled himself out of the game to where it would have then become a 3-3 vote between him and Tyson, and Russell would have been the very easy boot on the revote there. But it ends up working out. He ends up playing the idol on Parvati, Tyson gets voted out of the game, and through him pulling in Jerry and Coach the following round, he's able to then overtake the villain's tribe, taking out Rob at that point. And again, the fact that he's able to come from the bottom to taking over the tribe is really impressive in my eyes. Now, he does make a blunder afterwards where he is convinced by Sandra into voting out Coach there due to him thinking that Coach was against him, which is obviously not ideal. However, it also kind of works out for Russell, as through Coach being voted out, it feeds his perception from the Heroes tribe that the women are running things, and that eventually results in JT giving his idol to Russell, which I don't think was intentional on Russell's end. I don't think Russell was intentionally trying to get JT's idol from the other tribe, obviously because he didn't know what was going on in the other tribe, but he does make the most out of this, where he accepts the idol from JT, he hands out to Parvati, and then after the merge, he is able to get the numbers after Parvati uses the double idol there to take out JT. And from that point on, I feel like Russell has a lot of agency in the game, where from that point on, they do mostly pick off the heroes one by one. He's able to counter Sandra's play to flip to the heroes after pulling in Candace there, votes out Candace at the final 8. At the final 7, he's able to outplay Parvati by blindside Danielle, taking away one of her options there. And he's able to pick off the remaining heroes in Rupert at final 6, Colby at final 5. And he's in a spot at final 4 where he's guaranteed to get to the end, where he's able to take out Jerry after winning immunity himself, largely due to him thinking that Jerry would vote for him on the jury. And he gets to the end against Parvati and Sandra, only to lose. And I think that's a major issue with Russell, is I think he can't win the game by the end of it. And I think a lot of that's due to his bad jury management, where I feel like this season really demonstrates some terrible social play from Russell that really burns a lot of the people on the jury to the point where they just don't vote for him at the end. And I think his read as well, that he would have beaten Sandra at the end, is also a bad read on his end that also cost him the game there. So I don't think Russell was set up well to win the game, and I think he does a lot wrong to necessitate his loss. However, he also has a lot of agency during a lot of the game. He is able to really take control from the Tyson round on to really dominate the game alongside Parvati, but it's largely the fact that he can't win at the end. Then also, he's not really in that great of a spot early on in the game. That leaves him behind at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have someone who I just mentioned, but we have Russell Hantz, and this is his game from Survivor Samoa. And for me, his two games here are around the same level, where I feel like he demonstrates a decent amount of control here. Now, there's definitely a debate for his Samoa game being lower, as I feel like he doesn't reach the same highs as he does in his Heroes vs. Villains game. I feel like Russell definitely makes more impressive moves in Heroes vs. Villains, though at the same time, I think Russell's game is a bit more consistent, where early on, he's definitely in a better position on the original Fo'o tribe. He's more consistently in the majority during the entire pre-merge. Though at the same time, I don't think he takes over the tribe the same way that he does the Villains tribe, where while he does vote in the majority for a lot of those rounds, he's not really getting his way as much as he does in Heroes vs. Villains. Where I think the Ben Browning round is a great example of him not getting his way there, where he wants to keep Ben Browning around, but he's unable to do so. But regardless, he's still in a pretty good spot, voting the majority the entire time. Though he does come into the merge down in numbers 4-8 and has to overcome that deficit, and while he's able to eventually do so, I feel like there's still some rocky roads there, where at that first round, while it is a consensus vote of voting out Eric, he does waste his idol at that tribal, which is not particularly great, especially the following round where he is the main target by the Galoos, and he has to find another idol almost immediately afterwards. And while he's able to do so and play successfully there, the fact that he needed an idol to get through that round is pretty bad. And then we get to the final 10, where he is facing some adversity there, where the Galoos are pretty unified and take out Natalie, though he's able to make an impressive move there, where he's able to flip Shambo to his side, and is also able to convince John Fincher to vote with them on the revote there. And sure enough, it does result in a 5-5 tie, where John flips on the revote there. That's all pretty good. They take out Laura Moret. Final 9, they take out John as an easy scapegoat for flipping the previous round. That's all pretty good. And the final 8, they were able to take out Dave, and at that point, the Fofos are able to take the majority there. And it's sort of crazy how they're able to do that. They're able to slowly but surely dismantle the Galoos one by one. That's all pretty good. That was also around the final 7 that he does become a target at the Monica round. And while he does get through that, he comes off very cocky there. And through that, he ends up burning Monica along the way. And this is also around the point where Brett starts to go on his immunity run, winning the next few challenges in a row. And that he's forced to cut Shambo at final 6 and Jason at the final 5. In that final 4, he has to win immunity there. Otherwise, Brett would beat him in a jury vote there. And while he's able to do so and is able to take out Brett, he also unnecessarily lies to Brett by telling him that he's going to force a fire making challenge only to not do so. And obviously that burns Brett along the way. And he does end up losing in a 7-2 vote there. And I do have to fault him for underestimating Natalie and thinking that he could beat Natalie when obviously he couldn't. And obviously he gets a lot of flack here for losing due to a bitter jury. However, I don't think he necessarily loses in all scenarios, where I feel like in Heroes vs. Villains, he definitely loses in every single scenario. And I feel like he does more wrong to turn the jury against him. I don't think he does as much wrong in Samoa. And that's actually a reason why he's above his Heroes vs. Villains game here, is that I think Russell still had winning scenarios where I feel like he beats Mick in a final 2 there. I think he also beats Shambo. I think he also beats Jason. I think he definitely had winning scenarios there, though you also have to fault him for cutting Shambo and Jason along the way, and him just going all in on trying to beat Natalie when that was not his easiest beat there. Then also, he obviously treats certain people the wrong way, like Brett at the final 4, Monica at the final 7. And he also has points earlier on in the game where he's not really getting his way as much as you would like. You also have him needing an idol at the final 12. And again, there's definitely knocks to his game. There's a reason why he's not higher in the list. And there's definitely a debate for his game being below his Heroes vs. Villains game. But I feel like the fact that he at least had a bit more win equity on Samoa compared to Heroes vs. Villains, where he definitely had situations where he could win the game, only for him to not take those scenarios. But the fact that he had those scenarios to begin with, while still having a decent amount of control on the season, was enough to have this game one spot higher than his Heroes vs. Villains game, to where he's here at number 11. And with that, we have reached the top 10. These are the 10 best losing finalists in Survivor history, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 10, and I really struggle with this next placement. I kind of juggled this person around a couple of spots. However, number 10, I did decide to go with Aubrey from Survivor Co. Wrong. And the thing about Aubrey is, while I think she plays a very strong game from the post-merge on, I feel like the first half of her game is kind of whatever. Now, early on, the original Brain, she's not really that well positioned within that. She obviously has her freak out in the first couple days. And while she eventually finds her footing on their tribe, she also becomes a minority target during the one tribal they go to before the swap, though they're able to get out Liz there. Then we get to the swap where she is able to turn things on a bit to where she votes out Anna at the first tribal to go to and votes out Peter in the second tribal. Though even then, she makes a bit of a questionable move by crossing out Julia's name, and that kind of makes her come off as a bit incommittal moving forward. Though I do think the biggest knock to our game is the merge round itself, where her and Neil are on the bottom initially, and the plan was to split the vote onto Aubrey and Neil, to where with Neil having an idol, there's a decent chance that she goes home at that particular tribal, though that's halted with Neil getting medevaced. And obviously it's unfortunate that she loses Neil, one of her closest allies, right away. However, this is where her game really starts to turn on, to where afterwards she's able to get the women together and they blindside Nick at that next tribal. That's all pretty good. They later flip the game the next round by taking out Debbie. And then we get to the final 8 where she's able to pull in Ty, getting him to betray Scott and Jason by blindsiding Scott there. That's all pretty good. And from that point on, I feel like Aubrey has a pretty smooth ride towards the end of the game, where she's really able to get towards the end with people that are loyal to her, people like Ty, people like Joe. Though she obviously gets very unlucky at the final 5, where Joe gets medevaced, who was one of her easier beats at that point. And then also gets unlucky at the final 4 with Michelle winning immunity that really should have doomed her at that point, except Ty decides to save her by forcing a tie. They result in a fire making challenge where Aubrey wins that, and she does get to the end to where she does end up losing to Michelle. However, I do feel like she was pretty unlucky by that configuration, where she was planning to target Michelle at the final 5 until Joe won immunity. And considering how the final 4 reward challenge was meant to be the final 5 immunity challenge, there's a good chance that had Joe not gotten medevac, that Aubrey would have gotten Michelle out, and through that would have had a much easier road to a win there. So I do think Aubrey gets kind of unlucky to that end, though I think some of that is also counteracted by her getting kind of lucky at the merge that Neil got medevac, to where she would have been in a lot of danger had that tribal taken place there. So I actually think it kind of evens out by the end of it. But the reason Aubrey is this high on the list is I feel like her post-merge is incredibly dominant. I feel like she is a sole dominant force on that post-merge there. and I feel like she's still someone who had some win equity by the end of it. The problem and the reason why she's lower is that her pre-merge is kind of average. And I feel like there are points in the pre-merge where she makes some questionable decisions there, not to mention with the merge route being pretty wonky for her there. I couldn't really have her any higher than this spot, but she still played a pretty impressive game to where she's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we're going back to a more recent runner-up, and that is Austin from Survivor 45. And obviously, Austin, someone who I'm sure some people are low on due to how the game ended for him. However, I actually think Austin played a very strong game across the season, being part of a dominant alliance and being a pretty integral part within that alliance and being pretty safe during a lot of the game. Now, right at the bat, he's in a pretty good spot in the original Reba tribe to where he's part of the majority there alongside Drew, Dee, and Julie. They're able to hold the numbers there. After the swap, he and Drew are able to pull over Emily to their side, which is pretty impressive considering that Emily had already met Kendra during the first round of the game, and through that, Kendra should have had the advantage there. But despite that, Austin does pretty good work in pulling Emily to his side, and sure enough, they are in the majority for the one vote they go to voting out Brando. And then after the merge, the Rebas are once again in a pretty good spot, picking off a lot of the Obellos one by one. And Austin's pretty safe during a lot of the season. He actually never gets a vote against him the entire season, which I find pretty impressive there. And with him being pretty well positioned within the Reba power structure, he is in a pretty prime spot to get towards the end of the game and being in a pretty good spot along the way. Where I feel like the biggest issue with Austin's game is his loyalty to Dee. Now, admittedly, some of that is due to him falling in love with Dee, and obviously that's a consideration. However, that does lead to him making some mistakes. Where at the final 7, he leaks the Julie plan to Dee due to him not wanting to feel like Dee got betrayed by him, and through that, Dee ends up telling Julie about the plan. Julie plays the idol and takes out Emily, which is a pretty big blow to Austin's game. He does lose Emily there, one of his closest numbers there, and I feel like through that, that gives Dee more options in the game moving forward compared to Austin, and we see that the following round, where Dee is able to blindside him again, taking out Drew. And I do feel like Austin does give up a lot of control in the game to Dee by the end of it, though I think he's able to turn it around a bit at the final 5 to where he's actually one of the few people that's willing to write down Julie's name, which is the optimal move for him there. Mind you, he did kind of take a while to get around to it, but he was at least more willing to vote for Julie than Dee was, and the fact that it almost blew up in their faces is largely Dee's doing, but he's able to get through that round, and by that point, he wins final immunity, takes Dee to the end, and obviously it's not great that he takes Dee, considering Dee was definitely his tougher beat compared to Katurah and Jake, but even against Dee, he still gets 3 jury votes at the end, which I find pretty impressive, and one of those being Kendra, who he managed to flip at Final Tribal. So I feel like the fact that he was able to flip votes at Final Tribal and actually make it somewhat competitive at the end is a major reason why Austin is this high. Where while Austin does make the mistake of going up against his tougher competition, I feel like Austin does better against his tougher competition compared to people like Colby, for instance, people like Wu, for instance. Now, admittedly, he would have still needed 2 more votes to win the game, as Jake has said afterwards that he would have voted for Dee had it gone to a tie. But the fact that Austin was able to hold his own even against the toughest competition is pretty good there. And considering that he also beats Katurah and Jake, had that been the final 3, I feel like Austin played a pretty strong game across the season. Obviously, the reason he's not higher is due to the mistakes he made due to his connection with Dee, but even then, you can at least somewhat excuse that due to them falling in love a little bit, but I still think Austin played a pretty strong game, and for that reason, he's here number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have another player pretty similar to Austin in that they were part of a dominant alliance, they were a pretty integral force within that alliance, and they still had some win equity by the end of it, but we actually have the other game from the only other person that appears twice on this list, and that is Amanda Kimmel, and this time this is her game from Survivor China, and I feel like Amanda's China game is clearly better than her Micronesia game, where she was in a pretty powerful spot for pretty much the entire game, being closely aligned with Todd and Courtney, and through that they essentially dominated the game, where on the original Fei Long, they hold the numbers there, they blindside Leslie, they vote out Sharia after the swap, not too much to say there. After the merge, they hold the numbers and are able to pick off a lot on the Jong-Hoos one by one. They'll eventually blindside Jane's at the final 7. And while I'm a bit more impressed by Todd's game compared to Amanda's, where I feel like Todd was doing more maneuvering and was doing a bit more backstabbing compared to Amanda, I still feel like Amanda held a lot of control, where I feel like Amanda was very much working alongside Todd for a lot of the season, where we saw her talking about blindsiding Jane's at the final 7. You even have her considering blindsiding Todd at the very end of the game, and while she doesn't do so, despite her winning Final 4 immunity, I feel like Amanda was still in a very dominant position for a lot of the game, and was still someone who had win equity by the end of it, where coming into Final Tribal, it was supposed to be up in the air between Amanda and Todd over who would win, and while Todd was able to run away with it by the end of it due to his impressive Final Tribal performance and Amanda kind of dropping the ball, I still feel like Amanda still could have won the game had she given an alright final trial performance there. And I still think she's someone who could have won the game had she cut Todd at the very end, to where I'm pretty convinced that she would have beaten Denise and Courtney at the end there. So I do think Amanda was still someone who played a very dominant game, was very rarely in danger at many points. She never gets a vote against her the entire season, and was someone who was working right alongside Todd for a lot to really dominate the game. And I feel like with the fact that she still had win equity by the end of it, I feel like she definitely belongs in this grouping. And I feel like her game is not that off from Austin's, where the reason why I have her above Austin is I feel like Austin made more suboptimal moves like the final 7 and being unwilling to cut D at the end. I feel like Amanda was a bit more consistent in her strategic thinking throughout the game and was at least a more willing to cut Todd at the end than Austin was to D, which is why she's one spot higher at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and I feel like these next couple players are different from the ones we just talked about, where I feel like these players were more independent in how they maneuver through the game, where they were a bit more dynamic. And I feel like we're more sole dominant forces in the game compared to people like Austin or Amanda. By number 7, we're starting this grouping off with Mike White from David vs. Goliath. And I feel like Mike was someone that really navigated through the game pretty well. Now, he does have a rockier start than the people we just talked about, where he is obviously not in the greatest spot in the original Goliath group, and he's eventually forced to cut Jeremy at the first tribal they attend, someone he was a bit closer to there. But despite that, he's able to find more footing as the game goes along, where we get to the swap, where he's able to pull in Nick to form the new majority on the swap tribe. They vote out Natalie, they vote out Lyrsa, not too much to say there. We then get to the merge where the Goliaths do initially hold the numbers there, and they do take off Elizabeth without too much difficulty. Though despite this, we see him trying to build this sub-alliance, the Strike Force alliance with Nick, Christian, and Gabby, though that doesn't really go through by the end of it. We then get to the following round where he does try to keep Christian around, but is unable to get the other Goliaths on board. But despite this, the vote does eventually flip due to the Davids outmaneuvering the Goliaths in that spot. So I feel like that's kind of a rocky point for Mike's game there. And he is technically on the outs during the Dan round where he votes for Christian again. Though I think from the final 10 on, I think Mike starts to really take control of the game. We're at the final 10, they do vote out Alec, who is a pretty consensus target by that point. But then at the final 9, we see him successfully flipping over Christian and Gabby to blindside Carl and really taking control of the game again, where the Davids had taken control of the tribe due to them taking out John Hennigan and Dan and Alec. But Mike's able to take control back, really flipping over Christian and Gabby there. At the final 8, we see him flipping the game again to take out Gabby after Gabby considered flipping against Christian there. That's all pretty good. And then at the final 7, he does split the votes to take out Christian in that spot. Final 6, he's able to build a final 3 deal with Angelina and Nick, and through that they have a pretty smooth ride to the end, where at the final 6, he's able to take out Davey there, despite Nick not wanting that to happen. Final 5, he takes out Allison, and then final 4, he does have to go in the fire at that point, and obviously that's due to Nick winning out from that point. But I still feel like Mike has a major influence in how that end game plays. Basically from the final 9 on, he is a major player in how the game plays out there. And even so, he is able to get to the end of the game where he still has some win equity, where I feel like had he fought more at Final Tribal, he could have gotten more votes and potentially posed a challenge to Nick there, though he does kind of lay down his sword by the end of it, largely due to him kind of feeling bad that he was already rich and could have been taking away money from Nick, who was obviously from less well-off circumstances there. So I do feel like Mike is someone that played a pretty impressive game from the Final 9 on. And even before that, he was still in a pretty good spot for a lot of that and was still trying to make things happen, like the Strike Force Alliance at the merge, though he doesn't really get his way as much as the players we're about to be talking about, which is why he's a bit lower here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have a player kind of similar to Mike, but I feel like this player had more consistent control during the entire game, and that is Chase Rice from Survivor Nicaragua. And I feel like Chase also played a pretty solid game across the season, and someone that still came pretty close to winning. We're on the original LaFleur tribe. He's in a pretty good spot there, being part of Shannon's initial alliance, but still having bonds with the other side to where he does eventually flip to the Brendan side and is able to vote out Shan at that first tribal they attend, and is able to remain in a pretty good spot for the rest of the pre-merge there. After the swap, he is once again in the numbers, votes out Tyrone, votes out Eve. Again, not too much difficulty there. And then we get to the merge where he is once again in a pretty good spot, being in the majority for a lot of these early votes, voting out Alina, voting out Marty, voting out Brenda. We then get to the double quit, which also benefits his position moving forward. And really from the final 7 on, I feel like Chase is in a pretty powerful spot where he's able to build a new majority alliance alongside Sash, Jane, and Holly. And they should have a pretty smooth ride to the end. outside the fact that Fabio wins out from that point. And obviously, Fabio winning out is a major hindrance to Chase's chances of winning, where had he been able to get out Fabio at any point, he would have had a pretty smooth ride to a win at the end. But despite getting to the end against Fabio due to Fabio winning out, Chase comes pretty close to winning, where it is a 5-4 vote. And while some of those were sympathy votes to where supposedly it was going to be 7-2 vote of initially, the fact that Chase comes pretty close to beating Fabio, who was his pretty likable underdog, really speaks to how great of a game Chase played across the season, where I feel like he's in such a powerful position for so much of the game, really being able to maneuver around the game pretty effectively. He's never in danger at any point, and I feel like he's still someone who had win equity by the end of it, to where had he gotten his ideal final 3, I feel like he probably wins the season at the end. He just gets unlucky that Fabio wins the final 3 immunity challenges of the season to get to the end, but I still feel like Chase played a pretty solid game across the season, which is why he's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have another player who I would consider a sole dominant player, despite how the game played out for a lot of it. But number 5, we have the highest ranked new era player to talk about, and here we have Charlie from Survivor 46. And this may surprise some people, as obviously Charlie is known for working with Maria for a lot of the game. They dominate the game together. And through that, you would think that I would have Charlie down with the likes of Colby and Austin, like these players that are known for being part of dominant alliances. However, I think if you really look at how the game plays out, I do think Charlie outplays Maria at multiple opportunities and clearly gets his way to the point to where I would consider Charlie a sole dominant player on the season. Where obviously he is in a pretty good spot on the original Seagate group, where he's obviously aligned with Maria, and through that, they're essentially in the middle of the tribe, where they're close to the Tim and Ben side of things, they're close to the Jem and Mariah side of things. Though when we get to that first tribal, Charlie is the one who gets his way over Maria, where Maria wanted to get rid of Ben and work more with Jem and Mariah, while Charlie wanted to keep Ben in the game. And sure enough, Charlie gets his way, where Jem gets voted out instead, and they end up working more with Tim and Ben moving forward. You have the +1 alliance, where that technically should have benefited Maria more than Charlie, where obviously Charlie's not included in the +1 alliance, but we see immediately after the merge that alliance just immediately crumbles, and through that Charlie is able to keep more of the people in his game there. Now obviously they do face a setback in the early merge, where they do have to lose Mariah at that first vote, and Charlie was considered a potential target there, but wasn't really that much of an option. We get to the split tribal, where Charlie should have been dead to rights there, where after Maria wins immunity and with the Seagans being targeted, Charlie should have been primed to be taken out in that spot. But instead, Charlie essentially becomes a swing vote at that tribal. Now, admittedly, I think some of that's due to Maria's connection with Tevin through the journey, but I think Charlie also does some pretty good work there, and he does allow Tevin to go through with this soda blindside, which is pretty disastrous for Tevin's game, but it does set him up pretty well to blindside Tevin at that next tribal. And really, for the next couple rounds, we see Charlie and Maria really working to take out a lot of these big threats in the game, all with idols in their pocket. They vote out Hunter at the final 9, vote out Tiffany at the final 8, Venus at the final 7, and Charlie's in a pretty good spot for a lot of this. Though at the same time, he's not just working with Maria the entire time, he's also working alongside Ben, who he kept in the game from earlier, and they're able to build this new Final 4 alliance with them, Liz, and Kenzie that's essentially able to counteract Maria once again, to where we see Charlie being so ready to flip the game on Maria at the final 6, only for Maria to win immunity there, but even then create this perception that Q and Maria are this duo in the game, and that Maria is closer to Q than she is to him. Then through that, they're able to blindside Q at the final 6, which I find pretty good there. And the fact that they were able to keep Q in the game for as much of the game as they were was also pretty good, as they kept Q around as his smokescreen that further enabled them to blindside the big threats from earlier on. And then we get to the final 5, where Charlie does pull the trigger against Maria, taking out his closest ally in the game and doing something that neither Amanda nor Austin were willing to do, which I find pretty impressive there. He recognized that he would have lost to Maria at the end, and through that he took out Maria before Maria had a chance to take him out. And despite that, he still comes into the final 4, where he's still in a pretty good spot to get to the end, to where Ben is primed to take him to the end there. They see Liz as his pretty big threat. And after Ben wins immunity, we see Charlie having a pretty safe spot at Final Tribal. And despite this, he still had win equity at the end, to where despite going up against Kenzie, who was seen as his pretty big social threat, he only loses in a 5-3 vote, where he was essentially 1 vote away from winning the game, to where had he gotten just 1 more vote and caused a tie, Ben would have voted for Charlie and Charlie would have been the winner. Now with that, you can fault him for not getting that last vote, especially with that 1 vote in particular being Maria, who was his closest ally for the entire game. But even then, I don't know how much I can fault Charlie for not getting Maria's vote, considering that Maria had literally told him as she was being voted out Final Five that if he had gotten to the end that she would vote for him. And it was literally only after she got voted out that she changed her mind. I'm not really sure what Charlie could have done differently to get Maria's vote in that situation. And I think Charlie also gets unlucky by the fact that the jury is receptive to Kenzie in part because Kenzie needed the money more, where that was a big part of her plea during Final Tribal. I'm not really sure what Charlie could have done differently there outside of convincing Ben to put him in the fire against Kenzie, but considering that he had the assurance from Maria that he would have gotten her vote there and through that had the other votes, I don't really fault him for not asking Ben to do that anyway. And considering that Ben was taking Charlie to the end because Ben wanted Charlie to win specifically, not so much because Ben was dragging Charlie to the end, I don't really fault Charlie for how he loses the game as much as other people on the board. So I think to that end, that also propels Charlie above some of these other players we already talked about. But mixing that in with the fact that I feel like there are just so many points in the game where Charlie just gets his way over Maria, despite them seeming like this duo that was dominating the game together. Mixing that in with the fact that he was pretty safe during a lot of the game, to where while he was talked about as a target at a couple of points, he always had the numbers to stay regardless. And with him coming very close to winning, I feel like Charlie played a very strong game on the season, and that's a big reason why he is as high as he is. But obviously, he's not as outwardly dominant as the top players we'll be talking about, which is why he's only here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have a player kind of similar to Charlie in a lot of ways. However, this person did get a bit more unlucky in how the game ended, but we do have Steven Fishback from Survivor Tokensheens. And I think there are similarities between Steven and Charlie here, in the sense that Steven is associated with being aligned with a duo, that being JT, and they're essentially able to run the game together, and you can also add Taj into that as well. And I think Steven does quite a bit of work in setting themselves up moving forward, where during the pre-merge, they're in a pretty good spot there, never really in danger. They vote out a lot of the targets there, not too much issue there. Though I think Steven is also more involved than JT in creating the Exile Alliance, where him and Taj are able to build this bond with Sierra and Brendan due to their visits to Exile Island, and through that they're able to get the idols there. And while that doesn't end up panning out after the merge, I feel like Steven is still in a pretty good spot afterwards, where after the merge, Steven and JT are able to align with Tyson and Coach. They're able to get the majority there, despite their tribe coming into the merge down in numbers, but they were able to pick up Coach and Tyson. And while I think JT does plenty of work there, I think Steven is also working right alongside of him, being a pretty dominant force there, and they're able to slowly pick off the Timbiras one by one until they're down to the final 4, where at that point we do see Steven recognizing that he has to flip on JT, very similar to how Charlie recognized that he needed to cut Maria in order to get towards the end. Only the difference here is Steven is unable to cut JT due to JT winning those last few immunities there. And I think in some ways, Steven is more unlucky in that sense. The fact that he's unable to cut JT in a spot to where he knew that he needed to vote out JT if he needed any shot of winning. Though I think something helping Steven on this ranking is I think JT was always taking Steven to the end, as we see after JT wins Final 3 immunity. Whereas Maria has talked about how she would have cut Charlie had she had the opportunity to do so. And we even saw her and Q targeting Charlie at that Final 6, only for Charlie to outplay her in that sense. I think JT was more likely to take Steven to the end regardless, and through that Steven had a smoother path to the end. Though obviously Steven loses in more of a blowout compared to Charlie, to where he does lose unanimously, which is obviously not great. However, that's against JT, the person he wasn't even trying to get to the end against to begin with. To where had Steven been able to get out JT, I think Steven's a pretty likely winner of the season, to where I think he probably beats Aaron had he won Final Immunity there. So I do think Steven was someone who definitely still had win equity by the end of it. It's just that he got pretty unlucky by how the comp split out, and through that he got to his worst possible Final 2 scenario there. But I still feel like Steven played a pretty dominant game, very much involved in the decision making, and someone who was very rarely in danger during a lot of the season, despite him being this pretty big player. So it's for those reasons I have him here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have yet another player who is associated as being part of this dominant duo, but I feel like this player was more out in front compared to their partner, and that is Dominic from Survivor Ghost Island. And I feel like Dominic is also in this grouping, someone who played a very dominant game and was also associated with a duo, that being with Wendell. However, I do think Dominic was more out in front in the game compared to Wendell at more points. Mind you, I think Dominic gets off to a rockier start than Charlie or Steven, where right at the bat he is not in the greatest spot in the original Navidi, to where the tribe is split 5-5, and I also think Wendell was better positioned on that tribe, having more connections compared to Dominic there. And I feel like had they gone to those first few tribals, that it would have been a pretty dicey vote there between him and Chris, though he's able to survive to the swap. Then we get to the swap where he is blindsided, where he's on the outs during the Morgan blindside. Mind you, he does get a bit unlucky there, where Chris got sent to Ghost Island, and Eswatori would have targeted him had he been available to be voted out there, but he does get blindsided that vote. He does get outplayed by the Malolos there. That's not great. But I think he recovers well afterwards, to where he ends up aligning with Donathan and Laurel, and through that they end up running that tribe moving forward, really having the numbers over Chris, to where he probably would have gone one up on Chris had he ever gone back to tribal. After the second swap, he's able to throw the challenge to take out Bradley, who would have been a big threat for him after the merge. That's all pretty good. And then after the merge, he's finally able to get out Chris Noble, really corralling the tribe to his side to take him out there, and with an idol in his pocket as well, which is pretty crazy there. And from that point on, Dominic and Wendell essentially run the table to where they're able to pick off the old Malolos one by one, and they're able to have a pretty smooth ride there. And I think Dominic's also safer in the game compared to Wendell, where I feel like there are several points where Wendell's being targeted over Dominic there, particularly that final 8 round where Chelsea was trying to lead an insurgence against Dominic and Wendell, but even then they're able to hold the numbers there. They're really able to keep Laurel by their side and really running the numbers there. And then we get to the final 6 where he's able to pull off that great move by bluffing with a fake idol, despite him having a real idol there, able to take out Seabass there. And then at final 4, he's able to win final immunity, recognizes that Wendell was someone he needed to get out, and through that he does put Wendell in the fire, only for Wendell to win fire anyway, which is obviously pretty unfortunate. But even against Wendell, he comes extremely close to winning, to where he actually manages to have a tied jury vote, the only runner-up in Survivor history to cause a tie at Final Tribal, which is all pretty good there. And while he was clearly not getting Laurel's vote at that point, the fact that Dominic came so close to winning against his toughest competition is all pretty good there. And in general, I feel like Dominic had a lot of win equity on this season, to where I feel like he beats everyone on the board except for Wendell. And even against Wendell, he managed to force a tie there, which is all pretty good. And I feel like a lot of the votes that he ended up losing at the end are kind of wonky, particularly the Angela vote, to where Angela admitted afterwards that she kind of decided that at the last minute as she was standing at the vote there. Again, very fluky situation there. And I think he probably would have gotten Angela's vote in the tiebreaker had he put Laurel in the fire at the final 4 instead of Angela, which is obviously a minor issue there, but I don't think he really could have accounted for that anyway, so I don't really fault Dominic that much for making the decision at Final 4, as really the priority was getting out Wendell anyway. But I still feel like Dominic played a very strong game across the season, a very dominant game, where I feel like he was more out in front compared to Wendell. I feel like he was more proactive in trying to get Wendell out compared to Wendell getting Dominic out, and he still came very close to winning. Again, the closest person to actually winning the game out of all these people on the list. But in the end, he didn't do so, and he was still on the outs for those first couple of rounds of the game. That kind of leave him behind at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I feel like these top 2 are pretty obvious, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 2, we have a pretty notable runner-up, and that is Coach from Survivor South Pacific. And I feel like Coach played a very dominant game, where he essentially ran the game from beginning to end, and having tons of influence in how the game played out. Right at the bat, he is in the center of the Opolu group. He's able to build this cult of Christianity that's really able to bring the likes of Brandon to his side and really keep them loyal to him during a lot of the game. He votes out the outsiders in Christine and Stacy early on, these people that saw him as a temporary player. After that, he's able to blindside Michaela against Sophie and Albert's wishes, which I think really shows that he was the one running the show compared to them. And then after the merge, they do come to the merge tied in numbers. However, Coach is able to do really effective work in flipping over Cochran, who was the outsider on the Savaiis, really causing him to flip on the revote there and betraying his entire tribe, which is all pretty good. And once the opposed get the numbers, they proceed to pagong the old Savaiis one by one, really making efficient work out of that. And then once it's down to just the Opolus, Coach is once again in a very powerful spot to get towards the end, where he has the final 3 deal with Albert and Sophie. But even then, he's able to blindside Edna at the final 6. At the final 5, he's able to be involved in getting Brandon to give up immunity. And while I think Albert was also involved in that, I think Coach was also an influence in that, considering the relationship they had. They're able to take out Rick at the second final 5 round, and they're eventually able to take out Ozzy at the final 4. And obviously, Ozzy coming back into the game was a source of adversity for them, as Ozzy probably beats all of them have he gone to the end, but they're able to take care of that. And then it gets to the end against Albert and Sophie, where Obviously, I think one of Coach's issues is his jury management. I think Coach definitely struggles when it comes to that. I think the fact that he doesn't really own his game of Final Tribal is a major reason why he ends up losing the game at the end there. That and also the fact that he betrayed people like Brandon along the way. I do think Coach does things that causes him to lose the game at the end. And I feel like the fact that he has a pretty bad Final Tribal performance while Sophie is able to just run over him by calling him a little girl, for instance. I do think Coach does lose the game at the end, in part due to him not really owning his game. And I think Sophie just takes advantage of that at the very end. But I still think Coach could have beaten Sophie and Albert had he just admitted that he had created this cult around Christianity. The fact that he manipulated the likes of Brandon, for instance. I do think Coach was not necessarily a GOAT per se, but I do think he really just drops the ball at the very end of the game that causes him to lose. But he still played a very dominant game. He controlled the game from beginning to end. He had a complete stranglehold across so much that happened on his tribe, and after the merge was a major force in flipping over Cochrane. I think Coach played a very impressive game on the season, but obviously he lost at the end, and I do think he did a lot to cause his own demise at the very end, but the fact that he was as dominant as he was is a big reason why he's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the best runner-up in the history of Survivor is Boston Rob from Survivor All-Stars. And for me, I think Boston Rob and Coach was an interesting debate here, as I feel like both of them essentially dominated the game from beginning to end. Where I feel like Boston Rob was in a very similar position to Coach, where he comes into All-Stars with a pretty low target on his back due to him not really being a former winner, considering he was a relatively early boot on his original season. But despite this, he's able to come into the season in a very powerful spot. And we see him essentially run the game from beginning to end, where right at the bat on the original Zapera, he's able to take control of that tribe, blindsides Rob Cesternino at the one tribal he goes to before the merge. After the first swap, where Rudy and Jenna join their tribe, he's able to build a Final Four deal with them, and through that, he's able to remain in a pretty good spot with them. After the second swap, where Amber gets swapped over to the other tribe, he's able to make that deal with Lex to keep Amber safe. And while I wouldn't give Rob too much credit for that move, as it did stem from their pregame relationship, it's still a move that benefits Rob moving forward, as it keeps Amber in the game for one, but also prevents Tom from being in a position to where he would have been a swing vote coming to the merge, to where Lex had courted Tom to flip over due to them having played on the same season before. But through Amber staying in the game and Lex and Kathy voting out Jerry, it really allows the Chaperas to come to the merge up in numbers. And we see Rob immediately betray Lex there, voting him out there. And obviously he does burn Lex in the process to where Lex doesn't vote for him moving forward. But it was still a necessary move, and he is up in numbers moving forward. And they pagong the remaining Mogo Mogos in Kathy and Cheyenne. They do have to betray Alicia at the final 7 after Cheyenne wins immunity, but again, that was out of necessity there. We get to the final 5, where at that point, Tom does consider flipping the game on Rob and Amber, and we see him trying to pull Rupert there, but Rob is able to sow distrust between Tom and Rupert to where they are unable to work together there, and he does vote out Tom at that next opportunity, no problem there. Final 4, he's able to convince Jenna to vote out Rupert there, as Rupert was the biggest jury threat at that point. And then it gets to a final 3 where both Jenna and Amber are taking him to the end, but even then he's able to win immunity himself, takes Amber to the end there. And obviously he does end up losing to Amber at the end in a 4-3 vote, which is obviously a bit unfortunate. And a lot of it does stem from a lot of this jury just being really angry at both of them, to where obviously Lex was very angry at him. Alicia was obviously pretty angry at him as well for betraying her. And even Tom was obviously very anti-Rob by the time he left the game. But even then, Rob still comes pretty close to winning, to where the deciding vote there was Cheyenne, who ended up voting for Amber simply because Cheyenne thought that Amber was running the game for some reason, which is simply not true there. And even then, I think a major factor in all this is the fact that this was the first All-Star season. This was the first season where a lot of these people came into the season being friends, and they weren't used to having each other being betrayed like this. So I feel like the season was always going to be a bit more personal compared to other seasons, which in turn explains why there was so much animosity towards Boston Rob at the very end. And I think one other thing is that I think Rob probably beats Jenna had he gotten to the end with her there. And obviously, while you can fault him for not taking Jenna to the end, even that is pretty understandable, as he was obviously going to take Amber to the end, as they had fallen in love at that point, and they obviously go on to get married and that type of stuff. So I don't really fault Rob for that decision either. So I do think Rob is someone who obviously burns people along the way, but I feel like Rob did less wrong to cause these people to turn against him, considering the fact that this was an all-star season, considering the fact that he had fallen in love with Amber. And I feel like in comparison to Coach, I feel like Coach did more actively to burn a lot of people, and Coach did more to actively lose the game at the end, Whereas I feel like Rob was simply in a different type of environment at the time, but still played a completely dominant game from beginning to end, still had a winning scenario at the end, and even against Amber, came one vote away from winning. So I feel like for all those reasons, I consider Rob the best runner-up in Survivor history, to where he's here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now, I may do more of these big videos moving forward. This was a very long video. And for those who stuck around to the end, thank you so much for doing so. This was a very interesting process to put together. I also have a Patreon and a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.